Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I was 17 the summer I saw the ghost ship. The memory of it clings to my mind like mist over the sea. I never believed in ghosts before, but after that night, I wasn't so sure anymore. It happened during a family trip to a small coastal town called Blackwater Bay. The town was tucked away at the edge of the map, known for its rocky cliffs and stories of strange happenings on the water. My dad, a history enthusiast, was fascinated by the town's lore. He told me about the Eleanor Gray, a ship that vanished without a trace back in 1893. Some said it still appeared on foggy nights, sailing silently before disappearing into thin air. Just stories, I'd said, shrugging off the tale. I didn't believe in such nonsense, but secretly, I found it thrilling. That night, the sky was dark and the moon hung low, casting silver streaks on the restless waves. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take a walk along the shore. The air was cool, and the beach was deserted except for the occasional screech of a gull. I was halfway down the coast when I noticed the fog rolling in. It was thick, curling over the water like ghostly fingers. I stopped walking and stared out at the ocean. That's when I saw it. A ship. It wasn't like the fishing boats tied up at the dock or the sleek yachts I'd seen on TV. This was old, with towering masts and tattered sails that fluttered in the wind. Its hull was dark and weathered, as if it had spent centuries battling the elements. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the ship was moving silently. No creaking wood, no splashing waves, just silence. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a leftover prop from a movie. But the longer I watched, the more I felt something was wrong. The ship didn't glide across the water. It seemed to float above it, just barely skimming the surface. I wanted to run back to the safety of the cottage, but something held me in place. Curiosity? Fear? I couldn't tell. My legs felt like lead as I moved closer to the edge of the shore. Then I saw them. Figures on the deck, pale and ghostly. They didn't look like sailors. They looked like shadows, moving with an unnatural, jerky rhythm. One of them turned its head toward me, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt its gaze pierce through me. My breath hitched. The ship's bell rang, a deep, hollow sound that echoed in my chest. The figures began to move faster, their movements frantic and desperate. It was as if they were trying to warn me, recall me. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, swallowing the ship piece by piece. First the sails, then the masts, then the hull. In less than a minute, it was gone, leaving nothing but the sound of the waves and the chill in the air. I stumbled back to the cottage, my heart pounding. I didn't tell my family about what I'd seen. I wasn't sure they believed me. The next morning, I found myself back at the beach. The fog was gone, and the ocean looked calm, almost inviting. I walked to the spot where I'd seen the ship, half expecting to find some evidence, a piece of wood, a rope, something, but there was nothing. Later that day, I visited the town's small museum to learn more about the Eleanor Gray. The curator, an elderly man with kind eyes, showed me an old photograph of the ship. "That's it," I said, my voice trembling. "That's the ship I saw last night." He gave me a long, searching look. "You're not the first to see her," he said quietly. "She appears to those who are open to the unknown. Some say the crew is still searching for home." I left the museum with more questions than answers. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Was it a ghost ship? A trick of the mind? All I know is that the Eleanor Gray has left its mark on me, and every time I hear the sound of a ship's bell, I feel a chill run down my spine. I was 22 when I got my first job as a deckhand on a cargo ship. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved the ocean. The endless expanse of blue, the salty breeze, the sense of freedom. But after what I experienced during that journey, I learned to fear the sea just as much as I loved it. It was late autumn, and we were hauling cargo from a port in Nova Scotia to Iceland. The Atlantic was unpredictable that time of year, with sudden storms and freezing winds. Our ship, the Northwind, was sturdy and well-equipped. But none of us were prepared for what was coming. It started 2 nights into the voyage. I was on the night shift, standing watch on the deck. The sky was clear, stars scattered like shards of glass across the black velvet. The water below was calm, reflecting the moonlight in rippling patterns. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. Then I noticed something strange on the horizon. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a faint glow, like fireflies hovering above the water. But as I squinted, the glow grew brighter and took shape. It was a ship, its outline illuminated by an eerie, greenish light. I radioed the bridge, thinking it was another vessel nearby. "Captain, there's a ship about a mile off our starboard side. Should we change course?" The captain's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's nothing on the radar, kid. You sure you're seeing something?" I stared at the glowing ship, my heart pounding. "I'm sure," I said, though my voice wavered. It's glowing." There was a pause. Then the captain said, "Hold your position. I'll send someone up to check." Before anyone could join me, the glowing ship began to move. It wasn't heading toward us or away. It was circling us, its movements smooth and deliberate. The glow illuminated the water around it, and I could see its details more clearly. A tall, 3-masted schooner with torn sails fluttering despite the still air. The wood looked ancient, covered in barnacles and seaweed. But what really chilled me were the figures on deck. They were there, but they weren't human. At least, not anymore. Their forms were translucent, shimmering in the greenish light. Some moved as if they were working the ship, pulling ropes and adjusting sails. Others just stood, staring out at the sea, or at us. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their gaze, heavy and cold. The ship's bell rang, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo forever. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ship vanished. The glow faded, the figures dissolved, and the ocean was dark and empty once more. I was frozen in place when the first mate arrived. "What's going on?" he asked, looking around. "You called about a ship?" It was right there," I stammered, pointing to the empty horizon. It was glowing, and there were people on it. The first mate frowned. "You've been out here too long. Go below deck and get some rest." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The next day, I overheard the captain talking to the chief engineer in hushed tones. "The kid saw her," the captain said. "The Emerald Queen. You think it's an omen?" I couldn't resist. "What's the Emerald Queen?" I asked, interrupting their conversation. The captain hesitated, then sighed. "It's an old legend. Back in the 1800s, a schooner called the Emerald Queen disappeared during a storm. She was carrying a fortune in emeralds, and they say the crew turned on each other in a fight for the treasure. No one survived, but the ship was cursed to sail the seas forever, haunting those who cross its path." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And when people see it?" The captain's face darkened. "Bad things happen. Ships sink. Storms appear out of nowhere, and people go missing." I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in his voice was real. That night, the weather turned. A thick fog rolled in, swallowing the ship in a cold, damp embrace. The air felt heavy, and the crew grew tense. I could hear whispers among them, rumors about the Emerald Queen and what might happen next. Then the storm hit. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the sails and lashing the deck with freezing rain. The waves rose higher than I'd ever seen, crashing against the hull with enough force to rattle my bones. The ship pitched and rolled, and for a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of green light through the fog. The Emerald Queen was back, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The figures on deck were more distinct this time, their faces twisted into expressions of anger and sorrow. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I couldn't look away. The ship's bell rang again, louder than the storm, and a voice whispered in my ear, "Join us." I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was below deck, lying on a cot. The storm had passed, and the ship was calm again, but the fear lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. When we reached Iceland, I quit. I couldn't bring myself to step foot on another ship. Even now, years later, I avoid the sea. Sometimes, when I'm near the coast, I think I see a faint green glow on the horizon. And every time, I hear that bell ringing in the distance, a haunting reminder of the night I came face to face with the Emerald Queen. I never thought the ocean could be so quiet. Growing up in Maine, I had always associated the sea with noise. The cries of gulls, the steady rhythm of waves, the creak of boats in the harbor. But that night, the silence was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, as if the world were holding its breath. I was part of a small fishing crew, working on a trawler called the Blue Marlin. It wasn't much, but it put food on the table. We were out on a 2-day trip, hoping to bring in a good haul before the weather turned. The sky was clear when we left, the water calm. It seemed like a perfect trip. By the second night, we were deep in the Atlantic, farther than we usually went. The captain, an old sailor named Pete, said the fish were plentiful out there. The rest of the crew trusted him, but I felt uneasy. Something about the open water unsettled me that night. Around midnight, I was alone on deck, checking the nets. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over the water. The air was cold, but the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. As I worked, I noticed something strange, a faint shimmer on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the moon, but the light grew brighter. It was pale and bluish, flickering like a distant fire. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. Then the shape began to emerge. A ship, massive and imposing, its sails billowing in a wind I couldn't feel. I froze. It wasn't a modern ship. It was old, like something out of a history book. The wood was dark and weathered, and the sails were torn and tattered. It was a ghostly silhouette against the night sky, glowing faintly as it moved closer. I called out to Pete, my voice shaking. "Captain, there's a ship out there." Pete and the rest of the crew rushed to the deck, their faces lined with confusion. When they saw the ship, their expressions turned to fear. "It's her," Pete muttered, his voice barely audible. "Who?" I asked, but he didn't answer. The ship drifted closer, and we could see figures on its deck. They were pale, almost translucent, and their movements were slow and deliberate. They didn't seem to notice us at first, but then one of them turned its head, and I swear it looked directly at me. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. The ship stopped a few hundred feet away, its glowing hull cutting through the water without making a sound. Then we heard it, a low, mournful wail, like the sound of a distant horn. It echoed across the ocean, chilling us to the core. Pete grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to go. Now." The crew scrambled to start the engines, but the ship didn't move. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times the mechanic tried to restart it. The lights on our boat flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. The ghost ship began to glow brighter, and the figures on its deck started to move, their heads turning toward us. One of them raised an arm and pointed, and the wailing sound grew louder. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a voice, a chorus of voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me toward the ship. My legs moved on their own, and I stumbled toward the edge of the deck. Pete grabbed me again, pulling me back. "Don't look at them," he shouted. "Don't listen." I shut my eyes, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I could hear the others shouting, but their voices were drowned out by the eerie chant. Suddenly, there was a splash. I opened my eyes just in time to see one of the crew members, a young guy named Danny, climbing over the railing. He was staring at the ghost ship, his face blank, as if he were in a trance. "Danny, stop!" I yelled, but it was too late. He jumped into the water and started swimming toward the ship. We tried to throw a rope to him, but the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The ghost ship began to move again, its glowing hull slicing through the water as Danny reached it. The figures on deck reached down, pulling him aboard. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the ship began to fade. The glow dimmed, the figures dissolved, and the ship vanished into the darkness, taking Danny with it. The silence returned, heavier than before. The engine roared to life, and the lights flickered back on, but none of us celebrated. Pete looked out at the empty horizon, his face pale. "We'll never see him again," he said quietly. When we returned to port, we told the authorities what had happened, but they didn't believe us. They searched the area where Danny had disappeared but found nothing. No wreckage, no body, not even a piece of clothing. It was as if he'd been erased. I quit fishing after that trip. The sea wasn't the same for me anymore. Every time I looked at the water, I thought about that ship and the whispers. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the air feels heavy, I hear them again, faint and distant, calling me back to the abyss. The year was 1996, and I had just joined the crew of the Seafarer's Pride, a small cargo ship making regular trips across the Baltic Sea. I was young, just 24, eager to see the world and make a living on the water. Little did I know that my second voyage would change my life forever, leaving me with a story that still haunts my dreams. It was late October when we set out from Helsinki, bound for Copenhagen with a load of timber. The weather was colder than usual, and the skies were overcast, promising storms. Our captain, an experienced sailor named Victor, assured us that we could outrun any bad weather if we stuck to the schedule. The first day went smoothly, and we made good time. The sea was calm, though an unsettling gray, and the air carried the faint smell of rain. By the second night, the atmosphere aboard had shifted. The crew was unusually quiet, and even Victor seemed tense, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. I was on the late watch, tasked with keeping an eye out for other vessels or hazards. The darkness felt thicker than usual, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds. The only sound was the steady hum of the ship's engine and the occasional slap of waves against the hull. Around midnight, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of light in the distance, barely visible through the haze. I squinted, thinking it might be another ship, but something about it felt off. The light grew brighter, revealing the outline of a massive vessel. It was unlike any ship I had ever seen, with tall, ragged masts and sails that hung limp despite the breeze. Its hull was blackened, as though scorched by fire, and its decks were shrouded in an eerie, golden glow. I called Victor to the bridge, my voice trembling. "Captain, there's a ship out there, dead ahead." He grabbed the binoculars and stared into the darkness. I could see his expression change, his usual confidence replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "Turn the ship around," he said abruptly. His voice was low and firm, leaving no room for argument. "Now." "But, Captain." "Do it," he barked, and I scrambled to relay the order to the helm. The crew looked confused but obeyed, steering the Seafarer's Pride away from the glowing ship. It was no use. The ghostly vessel followed, its golden light cutting through the night like a predator stalking its prey. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. The rotted planks of its deck, the faded name painted on its side, the Midnight Tide. I'd heard stories of her before, whispered among sailors in dimly lit taverns. The Midnight Tide was a 19th century trading ship that had vanished during a storm. Rumor had it the crew had mutinied, killing the captain and dooming themselves to sail the seas for eternity. Sailors claimed the ship appeared before disasters, a harbinger of doom for anyone unlucky enough to see her. The air grew colder as the ship closed the distance between us. The golden glow revealed shadowy figures on her deck, pale, spectral crew members frozen in mid-motion, as though caught in a single moment of their cursed existence. Their empty eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, and their mouths moved silently, as if trying to speak words lost to the wind. The bell on the Midnight Tide tolled, a deep, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. The sound echoed across the water, drowning out the engine's hum. Victor grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Don't listen," he warned, his voice barely audible over the ringing. "Don't look too long. That's how they get you." Before I could ask what he meant, the ship's lights flickered, and strange whispers filled the air. They weren't loud, but they seemed to burrow into my mind, weaving through my thoughts like a dark melody. They spoke of the sea's endless depths, of treasures lost and lives claimed, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. One of the younger crew members, Eric, stumbled toward the railing, his face pale and eyes wide. "Do you hear them?" he whispered. "They're calling us. They need help." "No," Victor shouted, grabbing Eric before he could climb overboard. "It's a trick. Don't let them pull you in." Eric struggled, his gaze fixed on the midnight tide. The ship was impossibly close now, its glowing hull towering over us. I could see every detail: the rotted ropes, the rusted anchors, the faint, ghostly figures drifting in and out of sight. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at me, its face twisted in an expression of rage and sorrow. The seafarer's pride jolted violently, as though something had struck it from below. The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness. When they came back on, the midnight tide was gone. The sea was calm, the whispers silenced, but the damage had been done. Eric was inconsolable, muttering about the voices and how they needed him. Victor ordered everyone below deck, but none of us slept that night. By morning, the weather had worsened. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the waves grew choppy. Victor decided to make an emergency stop at the nearest port, but the storm hit before we could reach safety. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the sails and tossing the ship like a toy. Water crashed over the deck, and the crew struggled to keep the seafarer's pride afloat. Through the chaos, I thought I saw a faint golden light in the distance, flickering like a candle flame. The midnight tide had returned, watching as we fought for our lives. We barely made it to port. The storm subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us battered but alive. Eric disappeared that night, leaving behind nothing but his boots on the dock. Victor refused to speak about what we had seen, but his hands trembled as he signed the paperwork to decommission the seafarer's pride. I left the sea after that voyage. The ocean, once a source of wonder and freedom, had become a place of nightmares. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the toll of a distant bell and feel the pull of the whispers, calling me back to the depths. But I know better now. Some ships are meant to be forgotten, and some stories are better left untold. It was a quiet summer when I decided to join my uncle on a fishing trip along the Chesapeake Bay. Uncle Jake was a seasoned fisherman, the kind who knew the tides better than the back of his own hand. He'd spent decades on the water, and his stories about strange happenings out there were the stuff of family legend. I never believed most of them, until the night I saw the lantern ship. Jake's boat, the Misty Dawn, was small but sturdy, built for hauling crab traps and nets. We left the dock in the early evening, the bay glowing under the last light of the setting sun. The water was calm, and the air carried the faint, earthy smell of the marshes. We planned to set the traps, fish a bit, and head back before midnight. The first part of the trip went as planned. We worked in companionable silence, tossing traps into the water and keeping an eye on the lines. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the stars were beginning to appear, and the bay was still, the water like a sheet of dark glass. It was around 10 p.m. when things began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog rolled in from nowhere, swallowing the boat in its damp, gray embrace. Jake frowned, his weathered face tightening with concern. "This ain't right," he muttered, scanning the horizon. "Fog like this doesn't just appear out of thin air." I tried to brush it off, but the truth was, I felt uneasy too. The fog was so thick I could barely see past the bow, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional lap of water against the hull. Even the usual nighttime sounds, frogs, crickets, the distant hum of other boats, were gone. Then I saw the light. It was faint at first, pale, flickering glow in the distance. I squinted, thinking it might be another boat, but as it drew closer, the light grew brighter, taking on an otherworldly, golden hue. It bobbed and swayed as if carried by an unseen hand, and soon I realized it wasn't just one light. There were several, hanging from the rigging of a massive ship that loomed out of the fog like a ghost. The ship was old, its wooden hull dark and streaked with algae. Its sails hung in tatters, barely moving despite the still air. Lanterns lined the deck, casting their eerie glow over the ship's weathered surface. My chest tightened as I noticed figures moving on board, shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to float rather than walk. "Uncle Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see that?" Jake's face had gone pale. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the ghostly vessel. "Don't stare at it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't speak to them. And for God's sake, don't answer if they call." The ship drew closer, gliding silently through the water. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as every instinct screamed at me to look away. The figures on deck were clearer now, men and women in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. They moved with an unnatural grace, their eyes blank and unseeing. Some carried lanterns, while others seemed to simply drift, like shadows caught in the wind. The air grew colder, and a strange sound filled the silence. A soft, mournful humming, like a song carried on the wind. It was beautiful and haunting, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Jake grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight. "Now." He turned the engine on, but it sputtered and died, refusing to start no matter how many times he tried. The ghostly ship was almost alongside us now, its massive hull casting our little boat in shadow. The humming grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was voices, singing in a language I didn't understand. Then, one of the figures on the ship turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pull me in, and its lips moved as if whispering something just out of earshot. My mind felt cloudy, like I was sinking into a dream, and I took an involuntary step toward the edge of the boat. "No!" Jake shouted, yanking me back. He grabbed a flare gun from the cabin and fired it into the air. The bright red light illuminated the fog for a moment, and the ghost ship seemed to waver, its edges blurring as if it were made of smoke. The voices stopped, and the ship began to drift away, its lanterns fading into the mist. The temperature rose slightly, and the engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. But the eerie silence lingered, and neither Jake nor I spoke as we headed back to the dock. When we reached land, Jake tied up the boat and turned to me, his expression grim. "What we saw out there, that was the lantern ship. It's been haunting these waters for centuries." I stared at him, my heart still racing. "What is it?" "No one knows for sure," he said. "Some say it's the ghost of a colonial trading vessel that sank in a storm. The crew cursed to wander the bay forever. Others think it's older than that, something from before people ever settled here. Whatever it is, it doesn't belong in this world." I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the fog, a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The image of that ship, with its glowing lanterns and shadowy crew, was burned into my mind. I never went out on the bay at night again, and Jake sold the Misty Dawn a few months later. He claimed it was just time to retire, but I knew the truth. The lantern ship had taken something from us that night. Our sense of safety, our trust in the sea. Even now, years later, I can't forget the sound of those voices or the way the ghostly figure looked at me with its hollow eyes. On foggy nights, I avoid the water, but sometimes I see a faint glow in the distance, flickering like a lantern carried by unseen hands. And every time, I wonder if the lantern ship is still searching, still calling, for someone foolish enough to answer. When I signed up for the Atlantic Research Expedition, I thought it would be exciting, a chance to work on a modern research vessel, the Silver Horizon, and help collect data on ocean currents. I'd always loved the sea, despite its mysteries, and I figured the adventure would outweigh the risks. But I wasn't prepared for what we encountered out there, a ghostly legend brought to life. The journey started off uneventfully. There were 12 of us on board, a mix of scientists, engineers, and crew. We set out from Cape Cod, heading toward the Mid-Atlantic Ridge to deploy a series of underwater sensors. The ship was equipped with state-of-the-art technology, and the crew was seasoned and professional. I felt safe, even in the vast emptiness of the open ocean. By the third day, we were in deep water, hundreds of miles from the nearest shore. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the mood on board was light. We spent the evening playing cards in the mess hall, the sound of laughter echoing through the ship. It was a rare moment of relaxation in our demanding schedule. Just after midnight, the atmosphere changed. I was on the late shift in the control room, monitoring the equipment while the rest of the crew slept. The monitors were glowing softly, displaying the usual streams of data. Suddenly, the ship's radar pinged. A contact appeared on the screen, about a mile away. It was strange. There shouldn't have been another vessel out here, not in this remote area. I leaned closer, frowning as I tried to make sense of the signal. The radar showed a large object, but the visual feed displayed only darkness. I radioed the bridge. "Captain, we've got something on radar. Can you confirm?" The captain, a gruff but dependable man named Russo, responded quickly. "Acknowledged. I'll check it out." Minutes later, Russo called back, his voice tight. "We've got a visual. You need to see this." I rushed to the deck, joining Russo and a few others who had been awakened by the commotion. The ship's searchlights were on, sweeping the water, and then I saw it. A massive ship loomed out of the darkness, its silhouette faintly illuminated by an unnatural, greenish glow. It was unlike any vessel I'd ever seen. Its hull was ancient, made of weathered wood and iron, and its masts reached high into the air, draped with tattered sails. The name Eternal Star was barely visible on the bow, its letters worn and corroded. But the strangest part was the silence. The ghostly ship glided through the water without a sound, its hull cutting through the waves as if it were weightless. There were no lights, no engines, no signs of life, only the eerie glow that seemed to emanate from within. The crew stood frozen, staring in disbelief. One of the scientists, a woman named Clara, broke the silence. "Is it some kind of preserved wreck? A museum ship?" "No," Russo said firmly. "That's not a museum ship. That's something else." He didn't elaborate, but his expression said it all. He was terrified. And Russo wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. As we watched, figures began to appear on the deck of the Eternal Star. They were faint, translucent, their movements slow and deliberate. They looked like sailors, dressed in old-fashioned uniforms, their faces pale and gaunt. One of them turned its head, and even from a distance, I could feel its gaze. Then, a sound broke the silence, a low, mournful creaking, like the groan of ancient timbers under stress. It wasn't just a noise. It felt alive, resonating in my chest like a heartbeat. The ghostly figures turned toward us, their hollow eyes fixed on our ship. "Back inside," Russo barked. "Now!" We stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the hatch shut behind us. The captain ordered the engines to full throttle, but the silver horizon barely moved. The air grew heavy, and a cold wind swept through the ship, carrying the faint smell of decay. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the ship's systems went haywire. The monitors displayed static, the radar pinged erratically, and the engines sputtered. Over the intercom, the mechanic reported that the power was failing, though there was no clear reason why. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, filling the air with disjointed, unintelligible words. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. Clara clutched my arm, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. The whispers were hypnotic, pulling at my thoughts, making it hard to focus. I caught fragments of phrases, pleas for help, cries of despair, and something darker, a promise of doom. "Don't listen to them," Russo said, his voice strained. "They're trying to get inside your head." The ghost ship was closer now, its towering masts casting long shadows over the silver horizon. The glowing figures on deck raised their arms, as if beckoning us. The air vibrated with an unearthly hum, and I felt a strange pull, like the ship was drawing us in. One of the crew members, a young deckhand named Peter, suddenly screamed and bolted for the hatch. "I can't take it. They're calling me." "No," Russo shouted, lunging after him. But Peter was fast, throwing open the hatch and disappearing onto the deck. We followed, just in time to see Peter standing at the edge of the ship, staring at the Eternal Star. His face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Peter, don't!" Clara cried, but it was too late. Peter stepped off the edge and into the water. The ghostly sailors reached down, their translucent hands pulling him toward the glowing deck of the Eternal Star. He didn't struggle. He simply vanished into the mist, becoming one of them. The ghost ship began to fade, its glow dimming as it retreated into the fog. The whispers grew softer, then stopped altogether. The air warmed, and the lights on the silver horizon flickered back to life. We searched the area for hours, but there was no sign of Peter or the Eternal Star. The ship's systems returned to normal, and by morning, the fog had lifted, leaving us alone in the vast, empty ocean. When we returned to port, we filed a report, but no one believed us. They said it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations brought on by atmospheric conditions. But we knew what we saw. I left the expedition after that, unable to face the sea again. The image of the Eternal Star haunts me still. Its glowing hull, its ghostly crew, and the whispers that seem to come from the depths of the ocean itself. And sometimes, on sleepless nights, I wonder if Peter is still out there, sailing with them, trapped in the eternal silence of the Eternal Star. It was my first time working on a freighter, and I was eager to prove myself. The Harbor Queen was a sturdy old ship, tasked with transporting goods between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean islands. The crew was a mix of seasoned sailors and greenhorns like me. The captain, a stoic man named Morales, ran a tight ship, but he wasn't unkind. He had one rule, though, and he made it clear on the first day. If you see anything strange on the water, don't talk about it. Don't point at it. Don't even acknowledge it. Understand? We all nodded, though I couldn't help but be curious. Strange things? Like what? But Captain Morales wasn't the type to entertain questions, so I kept my mouth shut. The voyage was uneventful for the first few days. The weather was good, the seas calm, and the work kept us busy. At night, the crew would gather on deck, swapping stories under the stars. Most of them were lighthearted, but a few carried an edge of unease, whispers of ghost ships and sailors who disappeared without a trace. I chalked it up to superstition. After all, sailors were known for their tall tales, and the ocean was vast and mysterious. But deep down, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to their words. On the fifth night, everything changed. We were deep in the Caribbean, miles from any land, when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, the sky darkening in an instant as thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind howled, whipping the waves into a frenzy, and the Harbor Queen groaned as it fought against the surging sea. The crew scrambled to secure the ship, shouting orders over the roar of the storm. I was hauling a coil of rope when I saw it, a faint light on the horizon, glowing through the sheets of rain. At first, I thought it was another ship, maybe a rescue vessel, but as it drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The light wasn't steady. It flickered like a dying flame, casting an eerie greenish glow over the water. And then the ship appeared. It was massive, its blackened hull towering over the waves. Its sails were tattered, flapping in the wind despite the storm, and its masts creaked as if straining under some unseen weight. The name Starlight Phantom was barely visible on its bow, the letters weathered and worn. But what struck me most was the silence. Despite the raging storm, the ghostly ship moved with an unnatural stillness, gliding over the waves as if it were part of the sea itself. The crew, if you could call them that, were shadowy figures, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness. They moved with a strange, jerky grace, their heads turning toward us in unison. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, and a strange pressure settled over me, like the weight of the ocean pressing down. One of the figures stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I felt them. Whispers in my mind, calling me, pulling me toward the edge of the deck. "Stop looking!" a voice shouted, breaking me out of my trance. It was Captain Morales, his face pale but determined. He grabbed my arm and yanked me back. "Get inside. Now." The crew followed his lead, retreating to the safety of the cabins. But even with the steel walls between us, the presence of the Starlight Phantom was inescapable. The ship groaned, its timbers creaking as if something massive was walking across its deck. And then came the sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the depths of the ocean itself. "What is that thing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Morales didn't answer right away. He stared out the porthole, his jaw tight, before finally speaking. "It's a cursed ship. They say it was once a merchant vessel, captained by a man who defied the sea itself. He ignored the warnings, sailed into forbidden waters, and angered something ancient. Now, he and his crew are trapped, doomed to wander the ocean for eternity." The ship drew closer, its ghostly crew standing motionless on the deck. The wailing grew louder, filling the cabin with its haunting melody. I felt it tugging at me again, a deep, primal fear that made me want to run, to jump, to escape the oppressive weight of their gaze. But Morales wasn't finished. They say the Starlight Phantom doesn't just appear. It chooses. It's looking for something, or someone. What does it want? Clara, another crewmate, asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morales shook his head. "No one knows. Some say it takes the souls of the living to replace its cursed crew. Others believe it's searching for redemption, though none who've encountered it live to tell the tale." The storm raged on, but the Starlight Phantom remained, its glowing hull casting eerie shadows on our walls. The air inside the cabin grew colder, our breaths visible in the dim light. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. Panic set in. The crew huddled together, flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the beam did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Outside, the ghostly ship was so close now I could see the faces of its crew, or what was left of them. Hollow sockets stared out from sunken skulls, their expressions frozen in a mix of despair and longing. Suddenly, the ship lurched. Something heavy slammed against the hull, and the cabin filled with the sound of splintering wood. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air with their disjointed, haunting chorus. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, and I realized the Starlight Phantom was trying to claim us. "We have to fight it," Morales shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If we give in, we're lost." "But how do you fight something like that?" The ghostly crew began to move, their shadowy forms drifting closer. One of them reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against the porthole. The glass frosted over instantly, the cold seeping into the room. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the Starlight Phantom began to retreat. The glow faded, the whispers subsided, and the storm began to calm. The air warmed, and the oppressive weight lifted, leaving us shaken but alive. When we finally emerged from the cabin, the ghostly ship was gone, leaving no trace behind. The sea was calm again, the sky clear, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. The crew was silent as we repaired the damage and continued our journey. The memory of the Starlight Phantom etched into our minds. Morales never spoke of it again, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers on stormy nights, calling out from the depths of my memory. And I wonder if the Starlight Phantom is still out there, sailing the endless sea, searching for its next victim. The first time I saw the ghost ship, I was just a deckhand on the Horizon Runner, a modest cargo vessel that plied the trade routes between the eastern seaboard and Europe. The pay was decent, the work steady, and though the ocean could be unpredictable, I always felt a deep sense of calm being out on the water. That all changed one cold October night, somewhere in the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. The weather had been strange all day. The sea was unusually calm, almost unnaturally so, and the air carried an eerie chill that settled deep in my bones. The sky was clear, the stars like pinpricks in an inky black void, but there was something about the stillness that set me on edge. The crew felt it too, their usual chatter subdued, replaced by uneasy glances and muttered prayers. I was on the night watch, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air as I paced the deck. The sound of the waves lapping against the hull was the only thing breaking the silence. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just another quiet night at sea. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, like the reflection of the moon on the water. But as it drew closer, the glow grew brighter, more distinct, until I could make out the outline of a ship. It was massive, its towering mast shrouded in a ghostly blue light that shimmered like fireflies in the dark. The hull was ancient, weathered wood bound with iron, and its sails billowed in a wind that didn't touch the Horizon Runner. I froze, gripping the railing as the ship glided silently through the water. There was no sound, no creak of timber, no splash of waves, only the oppressive hum of that unearthly glow. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the ship was heading straight for us. "Captain," I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. "There's something out there." Within moments, the deck came alive as the crew rushed to see what was happening. The captain, a seasoned sailor named Logan, joined me at the railing, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the glowing ship. "It can't be," he muttered, his face pale. "You know what that is?" I asked, my voice trembling. Logan didn't answer. Instead, he barked orders to the crew. "Turn the ship around. Full speed ahead. Get us out of here." The crew scrambled to obey, but as we tried to change course, the ghost ship drew closer. Its glow illuminated the deck, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered like living things. And then I saw them, the figures on board. They were barely human, their forms gaunt and skeletal, their eyes hollow pits of darkness. They moved with a strange, jerking rhythm, as if their bodies were being controlled by invisible strings. One of them raised a bony hand, pointing directly at me. The air grew heavy, and a cold wind swept across the deck, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. It wasn't the wind. It was voices, low and mournful, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers seemed to wrap around me, pulling at my thoughts, filling my mind with images of storms, shipwrecks, and drowning men. "Don't look at it," Logan shouted, grabbing my shoulder and pulling me away from the railing. "Whatever you do, don't look." But it was too late. The ghost ship was almost upon us now, its hull towering over the Horizon Runner like a predator over its prey. The glowing crew began to move, their empty eyes fixed on us, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ghost ship began to vanish. Its glow faded, the figures dissolved into mist, and the ship itself disintegrated into the night, leaving nothing but an unnatural stillness in its wake. The crew was shaken, their faces pale and drawn as they whispered among themselves. Logan called an emergency meeting in the mess hall, his expression grim as he addressed us. "What you saw tonight was the Elysian Drift," he said, his voice low. "It's a ghost ship, a harbinger of death and disaster. The stories say it appears to sailors as a warning, a sign that something terrible is about to happen." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us like a shroud. No one wanted to believe him, but deep down, we all knew he was right. The Elysian Drift wasn't just a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. It was real, and it had chosen us. The next few days were tense. The crew worked in near silence, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the ghost ship. The weather worsened, the sky darkening as thick clouds rolled in. The sea grew rough, the waves crashing against the hull with increasing ferocity. On the fourth night, the storm hit. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the sails and rattling the rigging. The waves rose like mountains, slamming into the ship with enough force to send us staggering. The rain lashed against us, cold and relentless, and the thunder roared like cannon fire. In the chaos, I thought I saw it again, the faint glow of the Elysian Drift on the horizon. But when I tried to focus on it, it vanished, leaving only the storm and the endless, churning sea. The storm raged for hours, and by the time it finally subsided, we were battered and exhausted but alive. The Horizon Runner had taken a beating, but it was still seaworthy, and we pressed on, eager to leave the cursed waters behind. But the Elysian Drift wasn't finished with us. The next night, the ghost ship appeared again, closer this time. Its crew stood silently on the deck, their hollow eyes fixed on us. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the air with their mournful chorus. And then the attacks began. One by one, members of the crew started to disappear. They'd be there one moment and gone the next, their absence marked only by the faint sound of whispers and the icy chill that lingered in the air. We searched the ship from top to bottom, but there was no sign of them. It was as if they'd been swallowed by the sea. By the time we reached port, there were only a handful of us left. The Horizon Runner limped into the harbor, its battered hull a testament to the horrors we'd faced. We told our story to the authorities, but they dismissed it as the ravings of a crew driven mad by the storm. But I know what I saw. I know the Elysian Drift is real, and that it's still out there, haunting the waves, waiting for its next victims. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the sea is calm and the air is still, I think I can hear the whispers, calling me back to the water. It all began with a story, the kind sailors swap over strong drinks and dim lanterns. This one came from an old man named Elias, whose voice carried the rasp of 1,000 salty winds. They call it the Dread Harbinger, he said, leaning in close, his breath heavy with the scent of rum. A ship that appears out of nowhere, its sails black as night, its crew nothing but shadows. They say it comes for those who stray too far into the abyss. I was only half listening, busy packing supplies for our upcoming voyage. I worked aboard the Tempest Dawn, a research vessel charting deep sea currents off the Atlantic shelf. Our crew was a mix of seasoned sailors and scientists, and I fell somewhere in between. A marine biology intern hungry for adventure. The night before we set sail, Elias pulled me aside. "Mark my words, boy," he said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "If you hear the song, don't follow it. Don't even listen. Plug your ears and pray it passes." I nodded, humoring him, but his words lingered in the back of my mind as we departed the next morning. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the hum of the engines was a comforting backdrop to the bustle of activity on deck. The Tempest Dawn felt alive, a steel leviathan cutting through the waves with purpose. For the first week, everything was routine. We deployed sensors, collected samples, and cataloged marine life. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface shimmering like liquid glass under the sun. At night, the stars were so bright it felt like you could reach out and touch them. Then, on the 8th night, the stillness came. I was on the late shift, monitoring data in the control room. The air had grown heavy, the usual creaks and groans of the ship eerily absent. Even the waves seemed to have stilled, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. A strange unease settled over me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. And then I heard it. A faint, haunting melody drifted through the air, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't coming from the ship. It seemed to rise from the sea itself, a mournful tune carried by the wind. I stepped out onto the deck, drawn by the sound, and found a few other crew members standing there, their faces pale in the moonlight. "Do you hear that?" one of them whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. The melody was clearer now, a sorrowful dirge that seemed to seep into my very bones. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, a sound that tugged at something deep and primal. And then, on the horizon, I saw the ship. It emerged from the darkness like a specter, its black sails catching a wind we couldn't feel. The hull was ancient, encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, and its masts were warped and splintered. A faint green glow emanated from its decks, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the water. The crew, if that's what they were, stood motionless, their forms barely more than silhouettes, their heads turned in unison, as if sensing our presence, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. "Get back inside," Captain Vance ordered, his voice sharp. He appeared on deck, his usual calm replaced by a grim determination. "Close all the hatches and seal the doors. Now." We scrambled to obey, retreating to the safety of the control room. The melody grew louder, more insistent, as if it was calling to us. I could see its effect on the crew. Some covered their ears, others stared blankly at the monitors, their eyes glazed over. "It's the song," Vance said, pacing the room. "The Harbinger's song. It lures ships into the depths. Is it real?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The stories?" Vance nodded, his face grim. "Real enough. I've seen it once before, years ago. We barely escaped, but not everyone was so lucky. The dread harbinger loomed closer, its eerie glow illuminating the dark waters. The song was almost deafening now, a cacophony of sorrow and longing that seemed to echo inside my skull. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside me, pulling at my thoughts, my will. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ship vanished. The song stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The crew sat in stunned silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Vance ordered everyone to their stations, but the unease lingered, a shadow that clung to us like a second skin. The next day, we discovered the first missing person. It was Trevor, one of the deckhands. His bunk was empty, his belongings untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he'd gone. It was as if he'd simply disappeared into thin air. As the days passed, more of the crew vanished. One by one, they were there one moment and gone the next. We searched the ship from top to bottom, but it was no use. The Tempest Dawn had become a prison, its steel walls echoing with the sound of our fear. The song returned each night, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to seep into the ship itself, the walls vibrating with its mournful tune. The Harbinger appeared on the horizon, its ghostly glow a constant reminder of the danger we faced. Desperation set in. Vance tried to change course, steering us away from the cursed waters, but no matter which direction we went, the ship was always there, waiting. It was as if the ocean itself was conspiring against us, keeping us trapped in its endless expanse. By the time we reached the final night, there were only a handful of us left. The Harbinger was closer than ever, its glowing crew standing motionless on the deck. The song was deafening now, a relentless wave of sorrow that threatened to drown us all. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I stepped onto the deck, my legs shaking beneath me. The ship seemed to sense me, its glow intensifying as I approached the railing. The whispers began, a chorus of voices calling my name, promising peace, solace, release. But then I remembered Elias's warning. Don't follow it. Don't listen. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to turn away, to block out the sound. The whispers grew angrier, the air around me growing colder, but I held firm. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The Harbinger vanished, taking its song and its crew with it. The air was still, the ocean calm, as if nothing had happened. The remaining crew emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. We limped back to port, the Tempest Dawn a shadow of its former self. We never spoke of what happened, not to the authorities, not to each other. But I know the Harbinger is still out there, waiting in the abyss, its song a siren's call for the unwary. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the sea is calm, I think I can hear it, a faint, haunting melody carried on the wind, calling me back to the water. It was the summer of 1998 when I first heard about the Widow's Revenge. I was working as a seasonal deckhand on the Seafire, a small fishing trawler out of Gloucester. The ship's captain, a grizzled man named Owen, was the kind of guy who'd seen it all, or at least claimed to. He loved to tell stories, and most of them were hard to believe. But there was one tale he refused to joke about, the ghost ship that haunted the North Atlantic. It's not like the others you hear about, Owen said one evening as we sat around the galley table, the waves rocking the boat gently. This ship doesn't just appear and disappear. It's got a purpose. It hunts. Hunts what? I asked, intrigued despite myself. Men who've wronged the sea, Owen said, his voice low. It's said to be the spirit of a woman who drowned long ago, a widow who cursed the men responsible for her death. Her ship, the Widow's Revenge, appears without warning, and when it does, someone always disappears. The other deckhands chuckled nervously, but Owen's expression didn't change. Laugh if you want, he said, but if you see it, you'll wish you hadn't. A few weeks later, we were out on the water, about 50 miles off the coast, hauling in the day's catch. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain, but the sea was calm. It was the kind of weather that makes you feel like you're in a bubble, The world reduced to the boat and the endless horizon. As evening fell, a strange fog rolled in. It wasn't unusual for the North Atlantic, but this fog was different, thick and heavy, like a curtain that swallowed everything it touched. The temperature dropped sharply, and the usual sounds of the ocean, waves, gulls, the hum of the engine, seemed muted, almost distant. I was on the deck, securing the last of the nets, when I saw it. A dark shape loomed out of the fog, its outline sharp against the gray. At first, I thought it was another fishing vessel, but as it drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The ship was massive, its masts towering into the mist. The hull was blackened and charred, as if it had been through a fire, and its sails hung in tatters. The whole thing seemed to glow faintly, an unnatural light that made my skin crawl. It was moving silently, gliding across the water without disturbing the waves. "Captain!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "There's a ship." Owen was on deck in seconds, his face paling as he took in the sight. "Get inside," he barked. "Now." The crew scrambled to obey, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The ship was close enough now that I could see figures on the deck, shadowy forms that moved with an unnatural fluidity. They were barely human, their faces obscured by the mist, their movements jerky and strange. And then I saw her. She stood at the bow, a tall, thin figure in a tattered black dress. Her hair was long and wild, whipping around her face as if caught in a storm no one else could feel. Her eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and her gaze locked onto me. It was like being struck by lightning. My whole body froze, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Inside, Owen shouted again, grabbing my arm and dragging me toward the cabin. As the door slammed shut behind us, the air grew colder, and the sound of the sea faded entirely. The only thing we could hear was the creak of the ghost ship as it circled us. "She's here," Owen muttered, pacing the cabin. "She's looking for someone." "Who?" one of the deckhands asked, his voice trembling. "Whoever's got a debt to pay," Owen said grimly. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the cabin was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, one of the crew was gone. His jacket and boots were still by the door, but there was no sign of him. The only clue was a faint trail of water leading back to the deck. Panic set in. We searched the entire boat, calling his name, but it was no use. The fog was so thick we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the ghost ship was still there, circling like a predator. Then the whispers started. They came from all around us, soft and insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. They weren't in English or any language I'd ever heard, but I could understand them somehow. They were calling, beckoning, promising release. One by one, the crew began to falter, their eyes glazing over as they moved toward the deck. "Don't listen," Owen shouted, grabbing one of the men and shaking him. "It's her. She's trying to take you." But it was no use. Another man disappeared, and then another, each vanishing without a sound. The cabin felt smaller and colder with each loss, the air thick with fear. Finally, it was just me and Owen left. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with images of drowning, of cold water closing over my head. I clung to the table, trying to block them out, but it was like fighting a tidal wave. "I'm sorry," Owen said suddenly, his voice breaking. "It's my fault." "What?" I asked, turning to him. "She's here for me," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Years ago, I was part of a crew that left a woman to drown. We stole her cargo and scuttled her boat. I thought I'd escaped her curse, but I was wrong." The cabin door burst open, and there she was, the woman from the ghost ship. She stepped inside, her feet leaving wet, dark prints on the floor. Her eyes burned into Owen, and he fell to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he cried. "I'm sorry." She didn't speak, but her gaze was enough. Owen began to convulse, his body writhing as if caught in an invisible current. Within moments, he was gone, leaving nothing but a puddle of seawater where he'd stood. The woman turned to me, and I braced myself, expecting to meet the same fate. But instead of taking me, she simply stared, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked back out onto the deck, disappearing into the fog. The ghost ship vanished soon after, taking the fog and the whispers with it. The sea was calm again, the night clear, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I was found the next morning by a passing vessel, alone on the Seafire. I told them the truth, though they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to the stress of the voyage, the isolation of the sea. But I know what I saw. The widow's revenge is real, and it's still out there, hunting the guilty. And every time I set foot on a boat, I wonder if she'll come for me next. It was the kind of story you heard growing up in my little seaside town. An old legend, meant to scare kids into staying away from the rocky cliffs at night. They called it the Lantern of the Lost. The story was always the same. A ghost ship, glowing with eerie green light, would appear out of the mist on moonless nights. Its captain, a long-dead sailor, wandered the decks with a lantern, searching for his lost crew. If you followed the ship or the lantern's glow, you'd vanish, just like the sailors he was looking for. I never believed it, not really. I chalked it up to old fishermen trying to keep kids from playing near the dangerous cliffs. But that changed the summer I turned 16. That year, my best friend Lucas and I decided to take my dad's old rowboat out for a late-night adventure. It was a dare, more than anything. We were bored, tired of the same streets and the same faces, and itching for a story to tell when school started back up. The night we picked was perfect for it, dark, with thick mist rolling in off the water. The kind of night that made you feel like the world ended just beyond the horizon. We packed a flashlight, some snacks, and a bottle of soda we'd swiped from the kitchen, then pushed the little boat off the beach and into the waves. At first, it was fun. The water was calm, and the quiet was soothing. The only sounds were the soft creak of the oars and the occasional splash of a fish. We joked and laughed, feeling invincible in that way only teenagers can. Then the mist got thicker. It happened slowly at first, creeping in around us like a living thing. The moon and stars disappeared, and soon we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The air grew colder, and the water around the boat took on an unnatural stillness. Even the sound of the oars seemed muted, like the world was holding its breath. Lucas was the first to say, "Do you think this is the Lantern of the Lost?" I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't deny the chill that ran down my spine. "Don't start with that. It's just fog." But even as I said it, I felt uneasy. The air had a weight to it, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. And then we saw the light. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, barely visible through the mist. But it grew brighter as we watched, taking on a greenish hue that made my skin crawl. It swayed gently, like it was being carried, and I could almost make out the shape of a lantern. Lucas leaned forward, squinting into the fog. "Do you see that?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Maybe it's another boat. Out here? At this time of night?" Lucas shook his head. "No way." The light moved closer, and as it did, we saw the ship. It seemed to materialize out of the mist, a massive, ancient vessel with tattered sails and a hull encrusted with barnacles. Its masts were warped and splintered, and the entire ship glowed faintly, the same sickly green as the lantern. Figures moved on the deck, shadowy forms that flickered like candle flames. The light from the lantern swept across the water, and for a moment, it illuminated our little rowboat. Lucas let out a string of curses, scrambling to grab the oars. "We have to go. Now." I didn't argue. We turned the boat around, paddling as fast as we could, but the ship followed us. It didn't make a sound. No creak of wood, no splash of water, but it moved faster than it should have, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. The lantern swung again, its light sweeping over the water. This time, I felt something, a pull, like an invisible hand tugging at my chest. My arms slowed, and for a moment, I couldn't think about anything except the ship. The shadows on its deck seemed to call to me, their whispers just out of reach. Lucas grabbed my shoulder, snapping me out of it. "Don't look at it," he shouted. "Just keep rowing." I forced myself to focus, digging the oars into the water with everything I had. The ship loomed closer, its glow growing brighter. until it was almost blinding. The lantern's light passed over us again, and I heard Lucas gasp. When I looked up, he was gone. The oars were still in his hands, but his seat was empty. There was no splash, no sound, no sign of him anywhere, just gone. I froze, staring at the empty space where he'd been. The ship was right behind me now, so close I could see the planks of its hull. The shadows on its deck seemed to lean forward, reaching for me, and the lantern swung one last time. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up the next morning on the beach, soaked to the bone and shivering. The rowboat was nowhere in sight, and Lucas was gone. I told the police everything, but they didn't believe me. They said we must have gotten lost in the fog and that Lucas probably fell overboard. They searched for days, but didn't find a trace of him. The town moved on, but I couldn't. I started spending my nights at the cliffs, staring out at the water, waiting for the light to appear again. I had to know what happened to him, to all the others who had disappeared. I had to know if the stories were true. And then, one night, I saw it. The Lantern of the Lost, swaying gently in the mist, its green light piercing the darkness. The ship was there too, its shadowy crew moving silently across the deck. But this time, the lantern wasn't searching. It was waiting. I knew I should run, should turn and never look back, but I couldn't. The pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. I stepped closer to the edge of the cliff, the light growing brighter with each step. The ship seemed to tilt toward me, as if beckoning me aboard. And then I heard it, Lucas's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I don't know if it was real or if the ship was playing tricks on me, but it was enough to break the spell. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the light faded. The ship vanished into the mist, leaving nothing but silence. I never saw the Lantern of the Lost again, but I know it's still out there, sailing the waters near my town, searching for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in and the air grows cold, I think I can hear Lucas's voice calling to me from the depths. I don't answer. I was a skeptic. Ghost stories, curses, haunted ships, all of it sounded like tales meant to frighten children or entertain drunks at the bar. As a marine salvage diver, I'd spent my life uncovering shipwrecks and artifacts buried beneath the waves. The ocean held mysteries, sure, but they were the kind you could explain with science and logic. Or so I thought. It all changed the day I encountered the Iron Star. I first heard about the ship from an old sailor in the Caribbean, a wiry man named Felipe who'd spent decades navigating the region. We were sitting at a beachside cantina, trading stories over a couple of cold beers, when he leaned in close and said, "You ever hear of the ship that sails the moonless nights? The one that calls for the greedy?" I laughed. Another ghost story? Felipe didn't smile. "It's no story. It's real. They say the Iron Star only appears to those looking to profit from the sea. Treasure hunters, salvage crews, fishermen who take more than they should. The ship offers riches beyond imagining, but it always comes with a price." "What kind of price?" I asked, humoring him. "You'll see. If you're unlucky enough to meet her," Felipe said, draining his beer. "Just remember, when the lights appear on the water, turn back. No treasure's worth your soul." 2 months later, I was off the coast of Bermuda with my partner, Sam. We'd picked up a promising lead on a wreck that was rumored to be carrying a fortune in gold and silver. The coordinates came from an anonymous tip, a grainy map delivered to our office with no return address. It felt like a setup for a bad horror movie, but the potential payoff was too good to ignore. The weather was perfect when we set out. Clear skies, calm seas, and just enough wind to keep the heat bearable. We spent the day scanning the ocean floor with sonar, and by late afternoon, we'd located what we believed was the wreck. It was sitting on a rocky shelf about 200 feet down, and from the shadows on the sonar image, it looked mostly intact. As night fell, the air grew heavy with humidity, and the wind died completely. The ocean was unnervingly still, the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're being watched. Sam and I decided to anchor for the night and start diving in the morning. That's when we saw the lights. They appeared on the horizon, faint at first, like distant stars shimmering just above the water. At first, I thought it was another ship, maybe a fishing vessel or a cargo freighter, but as the lights grew closer, I realized they weren't moving like a normal ship. They flickered and danced, weaving in patterns that didn't make sense. Sam grabbed a pair of binoculars and stared into the darkness. What the hell is that? I took the binoculars and peered through them. What I saw made my stomach drop. The lights were coming from a ship, an enormous iron-hulled vessel with towering smokestacks and rusted masts. Its hull was covered in barnacles, and its deck was lined with shadowy figures that didn't look quite human. The entire ship glowed faintly, an unnatural light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking. "That's not possible." Sam laughed nervously. "It's probably just an old freighter someone's using for night fishing. You know how these legends get blown out of proportion." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The ship was heading straight for us, cutting through the still water with eerie silence. There was no sound of an engine, no creak of wood or groan of metal, just the faint hum of the lights and the occasional splash of waves against the hull. "Should we move?" Sam asked, his voice tight. "We're anchored," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's probably nothing. Just stay inside." We retreated to the cabin and locked the door, as if that would somehow keep the impossible at bay. The ship loomed closer, its lights growing brighter, until they cast long, flickering shadows across the walls of our cabin. And then we heard it, a low, resonant horn that seemed to vibrate through our very bones. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The lights outside began to move again, circling our boat like a predator sizing up its prey. Sam turned to me, his face pale. "Felipe's story. You don't think this is—" "Don't say it," I snapped. "It's just a trick. Maybe someone messing with us." But I didn't believe my own words. The lights stopped circling and focused on our boat. A figure appeared on the deck of the ghostly ship, a tall man in a dark, tattered coat. He carried a lantern in one hand, its glow a sickly green. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes burned like coals. He raised the lantern, and the light washed over us, filling the cabin with an unnatural glow. For a moment, everything went silent. The world outside disappeared, and all I could see was the light. Then the whispers started. They came from all around us, soft and insistent, like the hiss of the tide. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but they grew louder and more distinct with each passing second. "Take it, claim it, it's yours." Sam stood up suddenly, his eyes wide and glassy. "Do you hear that? It's calling us." "Sam, don't." I reached for him, but he was already moving toward the door. Before I could stop him, he threw it open and stepped out onto the deck. The lights from the ghost ship engulfed him, and for a moment, he seemed to hover in place, his body outlined in green fire. And then he was gone. The lights flickered, and the ship began to retreat, fading into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled onto the deck, calling Sam's name, but there was no trace of him. The sea was empty, the air silent, as if nothing had happened. I spent the next 3 days searching for him, refusing to leave the area despite the growing storm. When the Coast Guard finally found me, they chalked the whole thing up to an accident, a tragic loss at sea. But I knew the truth. Sam wasn't gone. He was taken. To this day, I can't look at the ocean without remembering the glow of those lights or the hum of that impossible ship. I've given up salvage diving, but the Iron Star still haunts me. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I sometimes hear whispers in the back of my mind, urging me to return to the sea. I never will, but I know it's out there, waiting for its next victim, waiting for someone greedy enough to take the bait. I grew up hearing stories about the Morning Tide, a merchant vessel that vanished without a trace more than a century ago. She'd set sail from Liverpool in 1892, bound for New York, carrying a cargo of fine silks, spices, and the dreams of a crew longing for wealth and adventure. But somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, she disappeared. Some said she'd hit an iceberg, others blamed pirates. The more superstitious whispered of a curse, claiming the ship had angered the sea. But what made the Morning Tide infamous wasn't her disappearance. It was her reappearances. Over the years, sailors claimed to have seen her drifting through the mist, her sails tattered, her decks empty, glowing faintly under the moonlight. The stories always ended the same. The ship would vanish as suddenly as she appeared, leaving behind no proof of her existence. Most people dismissed it as sailors' lore, tales spun to pass the time on long voyages. But I never expected to see her myself, until the summer I joined the crew of the Harbor Wind. I just turned 19 and was eager for adventure. The Harbor Wind was a fishing trawler out of Nova Scotia, and its captain, a gruff man named McLeod, was known for taking chances. That summer, he decided to push farther into the Atlantic than usual, chasing rumors of a bounty of fish and waters few dared to enter. The trip started well enough. The crew was in high spirits, and the haul was better than any of us had hoped for. But as we ventured farther from shore, the weather turned strange. The air grew heavy and still, and a thick fog settled over the water. It wasn't unusual for the Atlantic, but there was something unsettling about this fog. It seemed almost alive, swirling and shifting like it was watching us. On the third night, the wind died completely, and the Harbor Wind came to a standstill. The crew was restless, muttering about bad luck and the need to turn back. But McLeod was stubborn. "A little fog won't scare us off," he said. "We've got a job to do." We dropped anchor and settled in for the night. I was on the deck, staring out into the mist, when I saw the first sign of her. A faint light on the horizon, flickering like a candle flame. At first, I thought it was another ship, maybe a fishing vessel or a freighter. But as the light grew closer, I realized it wasn't moving like a modern ship. It swayed and bobbed, as if caught in a current that didn't exist. "Hey, do you see that?" I called to one of the deckhands, a wiry man named Joe. He squinted into the fog, his face pale. "God help us," he muttered. "It's her." "Who?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He turned and hurried below deck, muttering prayers under his breath. The light grew brighter, and the outline of a ship began to take shape. She was massive, her hull black as night and her sails tattered and frayed. The name Morning Tide was painted on her side, though the letters were faded and streaked with rust. The ship glowed faintly, an eerie silver light that seemed to come from within. I couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about her, something that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. She was beautiful in a way that only something utterly wrong could be. The Morning Tide drifted closer, and I saw her deck for the first time. It was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to move on their own. The wheel turned, though there was no one to steer it, and the sails billowed in a wind that didn't exist. What the hell is this? McLeod had joined me on the deck, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "It's the Morning Tide," Joe said from behind us, his voice trembling. "She's come to take us." "Take us where?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Joe shook his head. "It doesn't matter. No one who boards her ever comes back." The fog thickened, wrapping around the Harbor Wind like a shroud. The air grew colder, and the sound of the waves faded until there was nothing but silence. And then we heard it, a low, mournful bell, tolling from the Morning Tide. It echoed through the fog, each note sending a shiver down my spine. McLeod grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We scrambled to haul up the anchor, but no matter how hard we tried, the chain wouldn't budge. It was as if the ocean itself had claimed it. The Morning Tide was closer now, so close I could see the barnacles on her hull and the rope hanging from her masts. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of our frantic movements, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the air. They weren't voices exactly, more like the memory of voices, overlapping and echoing in a way that made my head ache. "Come aboard," they seemed to say. "Join us." I saw one of the crew, a young man named Peter, step toward the edge of the deck. His eyes were glazed, and he moved as if in a trance. "Peter, stop!" I shouted, but he didn't seem to hear me. Before anyone could stop him, he climbed over the railing and leapt into the water. He didn't sink. He floated toward the Morning Tide, his body limp and lifeless. The shadows on her deck seemed to shift, reaching out to him, and then he was gone. "Get below deck," McLeod shouted. "Now!" We scrambled to obey, locking ourselves in the cabin. The whispers didn't stop, but they seemed fainter down there, less overwhelming. We huddled together, waiting for the fog to lift, for the morning tide to disappear. But the night dragged on, and she stayed, her bell tolling every few minutes. By dawn, the fog had thinned, and the morning tide was gone. The air was still heavy, and the deck of the harbor wind was eerily quiet. Peter was nowhere to be found, and neither was the anchor. We didn't speak as we turned the ship around and headed back to shore. I left the sea after that trip. The Harbor Wind was sold to another captain, and I heard she sank a year later, taking her crew with her. As for the Morning Tide, I never saw her again, but I know she's still out there, waiting for her next victim. They say the sea doesn't forgive greed, and after that night, I believe it. If you ever see a light in the fog, turn back. No treasure, no catch, no adventure is worth what the morning tide will take from you. It was supposed to be just another routine patrol. As a member of the Coast Guard, I'd seen my fair share of oddities on the water: capsized yachts, stranded fishing boats, even the occasional smuggling operation. But nothing prepared me for the night we encountered the Ebon Wave. The Ebon Wave was a ship spoken of in hushed tones among sailors in our region. It was said to be a whaling vessel from the early 1800s, cursed after its crew slaughtered an albino whale thought to be sacred by the native tribes. According to the stories, the ship disappeared on its maiden voyage, swallowed by a freak storm. But over the years, sightings of the Ebon Wave had been reported, always in the dead of night, always in thick fog. I never believed in ghost ships, until that night. The night shift started like any other. The weather was calm, with only a light breeze rustling the surface of the water. My partner, Officer Daniels, and I were stationed on the Mariner's Hope, a sturdy patrol boat equipped with radar and sonar. Our job was to keep an eye out for distressed vessels or any signs of illegal activity. Around midnight, the fog rolled in. It came quickly, swallowing the coastline in a matter of minutes. The air grew cold, and the radio crackled with static. Daniels cursed under his breath as he fiddled with the knobs. "Signal's weak," he said. "Could be the fog. Let's stay sharp," I replied, peering into the murky distance. The fog was so thick I could barely see past the bow of our boat. That's when the radar picked up something, a blip, faint but unmistakable. It was about half a mile ahead, stationary. "Looks like a vessel," I said. "Could be a fishing boat caught in the fog." Daniels frowned at the screen. "No transponder signal." "That's odd." We decided to investigate. As we approached the coordinates, the blip on the radar grew stronger, but no shape emerged from the fog. The water was calm, eerily so, and the only sound was the hum of our engine. Then, out of the mist, a shadow began to form. It was massive, towering over our small patrol boat. At first, I thought it was a cargo ship, but as we drew closer, the details came into focus. The hull was blackened and scarred, as if it had been through countless storms. The masts were splintered, and the sails hung in tattered shreds. Barnacles clung to the wood, and the name Ebon Wave was barely visible under layers of grime. Daniels and I exchanged a glance. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "This can't be real." We circled the ship, shining our spotlight onto its deck. There was no movement, no sign of life. The windows of the captain's cabin were dark, and the wheel was frozen in place. But there was something about the ship that felt alive. The air around it seemed heavier, pressing against us like an invisible force. "Should we board?" Daniels asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Protocol dictated that we investigate any unmanned vessels, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. Still, I couldn't ignore the duty drilled into me. "We'll take a look," I said, "but stay close." We secured our boat to the Ebon Wave and climbed aboard. The deck creaked under our weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. The air was colder here, and the smell of salt and decay was overwhelming. The ship felt like a relic from another time. Harpoons and rusted chains littered the deck, alongside barrels marked with faded symbols. The wood was warped and splintered, and every step seemed to awaken the ship, sending vibrations through the planks. We headed toward the captain's cabin, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The door was ajar, swaying gently in an unseen breeze. Daniels pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The cabin was a snapshot of chaos. Maps and charts were strewn across the table, pinned down by a rusted compass. A logbook lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. I picked it up and scanned the entries, but the handwriting was nearly illegible. One phrase, however, stood out, scrawled repeatedly across several pages. "The sea is watching. The sea is waiting." Daniels shivered. "This place gives me the creeps. Let's get out of here." I nodded, but as we turned to leave, a low, resonant groan echoed through the ship. It wasn't the sound of wood settling. It was deeper, almost like a voice. We froze, our flashlights darting across the room. "Did you hear that?" Daniels whispered. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the flashlight in my hand flickered and died. "Daniels?" I called out, my voice shaking. "I'm here," he said, though his voice sounded distant. "What the hell is going on?" The groan came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They echoed through the ship, growing closer with each passing second. "We need to get out of here," I said, fumbling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut, something stronger than any lock or latch. The footsteps stopped outside the cabin, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a sharp knock rattled the door, followed by a voice, low, guttural, and ancient. "Leave," it said. "This is not your place." The lights in the cabin flickered, revealing a shadowy figure standing just outside the window. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the fog. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. Daniels grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't argue. Together, we threw ourselves against the door, and it finally gave way. We stumbled onto the deck, our flashlights flickering back to life. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around us like a living thing. As we made our way back to our patrol boat, the groaning sound returned, louder and more insistent. The ebon wave seemed to shudder, her masts creaking and her hull groaning as if she were trying to break free from the water itself. We didn't look back as we cut the ropes and sped away. The fog clung to us, and the ebon wave faded into the mist, her ghostly silhouette disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Back on shore, we filed a report, but no one believed us. The ebon wave was a legend, they said, a story told to frighten young sailors. But Daniels and I knew the truth. We'd seen her, boarded her, and felt the weight of her curse. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the ebon wave is still out there, waiting in the fog for her next unsuspecting visitors. And when the sea is quiet and the air is cold, I sometimes hear her groaning, calling out to the living to join her in the depths. I've always loved the sea. There's something about the endless horizon, the salty air, and the rhythmic crash of waves that feels eternal. But after what I experienced last autumn, I'm not sure I'll ever look at the ocean the same way again. It started with an invitation. My uncle, a seasoned mariner named Captain Harris, had spent his life on the water. He owned a modest cargo ship called the Sea Wanderer and had recently taken on a job transporting goods along the eastern seaboard. Knowing my fascination with the sea, he invited me to join him on one of his trips. I jumped at the chance, eager for adventure. The first few days were uneventful. The crew was friendly, and the weather was calm. We spent our nights anchored off the coast, enjoying the quiet lull of the ocean. But as we ventured farther from shore, the mood began to shift. It was the third night when we first noticed the fog. It rolled in quickly, thick and heavy, obscuring the stars and turning the world into a monochrome blur. The crew grew uneasy, muttering about bad omens and unnatural weather. Uncle Harris dismissed their concerns, but even he seemed more tense than usual. "Fog's just part of the sea," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We'll be fine." But as the hours passed, the fog didn't lift. If anything, it grew denser, wrapping around the Sea Wanderer like a shroud. The air grew colder, and the sound of the waves seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. That's when we saw the lights. They appeared on the horizon, faint at first but growing brighter as they approached. At first, we thought it was another ship, perhaps a freighter or a cruise liner. But as the shape emerged from the fog, it became clear that this was something else entirely. The ship was enormous, its masts towering into the mist. Its hull was dark and weathered, and its sails billowed despite the absence of wind. Lanterns hung from the rigging, casting a ghostly glow over the deck. And then there were the figures, shadowy shapes moving about, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. The crew froze, staring in stunned silence. "It's the Phantom Fleet," one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "God help us." "The what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ship as if he couldn't look away. Uncle Harris grabbed my arm and sighed. "Now." We retreated to the cabin, but the atmosphere was electric with fear. The crew huddled together, speaking in hushed tones about the legend of the Phantom Fleet, a ghostly armada said to appear in the densest fog, luring ships to their doom. According to the stories, no one who encountered the fleet ever returned to tell the tale. "Those are just stories," Harris said, though he didn't sound convinced. "There's got to be a logical explanation." But deep down, I knew there wasn't. The hours dragged on, and the fog showed no signs of lifting. The ghostly ship lingered, circling the Sea Wanderer like a predator stalking its prey. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of other ships in the distance, smaller vessels, their outlines barely visible in the mist. They moved in eerie unison, as if guided by an unseen force. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadowy figures on the ghost ship seemed to multiply, their forms becoming more distinct with each pass. They moved with an unnatural grace, their movements fluid and almost mechanical. "We need to get out of here," one of the crew said, his voice cracking. "We have to move. We can't navigate in this fog," Harris replied. "We'd run aground or worse, but staying put felt just as dangerous." The Phantom Fleet was getting closer, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and an unnatural stillness had settled over the Sea Wanderer. Then, we heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around us. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the creak of wood. It was something else, something alive. It rose and fell, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "What is that?" I whispered. No one answered. The wail grew louder, joined by the sound of drums, slow, rhythmic beats that seemed to echo through the fog. It was a call to something, though I didn't want to think about what. The crew exchanged panicked glances, their fear palpable. Suddenly, the lights on the ghost ship flared brighter, illuminating the surrounding fog. For a brief moment, I saw them clearly, the other ships in the fleet. There were dozens of them, their hulls in various states of decay. Some looked ancient, their sails torn and masts splintered. Others were more modern, their rusted exteriors suggesting they'd been lost more recently. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping and echoing in a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, angry, desperate. One of the crew bolted, scrambling up to the deck. "I can't stay here," he shouted. "I have to get off this ship." "Wait," Harris called after him, but it was too late. The man disappeared into the fog, his footsteps fading into silence. We never saw him again. The whispers continued, weaving through the cabin like an invisible thread. The temperature dropped further, and frost began to form on the windows. I could see my breath, each exhale hanging in the air like smoke. "We need to do something," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't just sit here." Harris nodded, his jaw set. "We'll try the engine. If we can get moving, maybe we can break through the fog." The crew sprang into action, their fear giving way to a frantic determination. We started the engine, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Slowly, the Sea Wanderer began to move. For a moment, it felt like we might escape. The fog seemed to thin, and the ghostly ships faded into the distance. But then, the wail returned, louder and more insistent. The water around us churned, and the sea wanderers shuddered violently. The Phantom Fleet was back, surrounding us on all sides. The ghost ship we'd seen earlier loomed ahead, its prow cutting through the water like a knife. The shadowy figures on its deck were clearer now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "They're not going to let us leave," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. The wailing reached a deafening crescendo, and the ghost ship surged forward, its hull impossibly close. I braced myself for impact, but it never came. Instead, the ship passed through us, its form dissolving into a swirling mist. The fog lifted abruptly, revealing the open ocean. The Phantom Fleet was gone, as if it had never been there. The crew stood in stunned silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the gentle lapping of waves. We made it back to port the next morning, but none of us spoke about what had happened. The crew disbanded soon after, and the Sea Wanderer was sold to a new owner. I heard it sank a year later, taking its crew with it. To this day, I can't explain what we saw that night. The Phantom Fleet remains a mystery, its legend whispered among sailors and mariners. I don't know if it's real or some trick of the mind, but I do know one thing. There are forces on the sea that we can't understand, and sometimes it's better not to try. When I first took the job as a deckhand aboard the Crescent Dawn, I thought it would be the adventure of a lifetime. The ship was a small cargo vessel, tasked with transporting supplies between remote islands in the North Atlantic. The pay wasn't great, but the promise of open water and a break from my monotonous life in the city was enough to seal the deal. I didn't know that by the end of that journey, I'd never want to set foot on a boat again. It started on the 5th night of the voyage. The Crescent Dawn had left the port of Reykjavik a few days earlier, bound for a small island with a population of fewer than 50 people. The captain, a gruff man named Lyle, had assured me and the other crew members that the route was straightforward and that the weather forecast was clear. But as dusk fell that night, the weather changed. The sky darkened, heavy clouds rolled in, and the sea turned restless. The wind howled like a living thing, and a cold drizzle began to fall. I was on deck with Matteo, the ship's cook, when we first saw the light. It was faint at first, a soft glow on the horizon, but it grew brighter with each passing moment. At first, we thought it was another ship, perhaps a fishing trawler or a passing freighter. "Odd," Matteo said, squinting at the light. "It's not moving." I nodded. The light was stationary, hovering just above the water like a lantern held aloft by an invisible hand. Something about it made my skin crawl. "Should we tell the captain?" I asked. Matteo hesitated, then nodded. "Better safe than sorry." We headed to the bridge, where Captain Lyle was poring over charts. When we told him about the light, he frowned but didn't seem concerned. "Probably a buoy or a lighthouse," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But as the hours passed, the light didn't fade. If anything, it grew closer. By midnight, the light was directly in our path. It pulsed softly, casting an eerie glow over the water. The crew gathered on deck, their faces illuminated by the strange radiance. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. "Captain," one of the crew members finally said, "are we going to steer clear of it?" Lyle stared at the light, his jaw clenched. "We hold our course," he said. "It's probably just a ship at anchor." But as we drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary ship. The glow revealed the silhouette of a massive vessel, its masts rising high into the misty sky. Its hull was blackened and weathered, as if it had spent centuries adrift. The sails were torn and tattered, fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. And the source of the light, a single lantern, hung from the prow, casting an unnatural glow that seemed to seep into the very air around it. The crew murmured nervously, and even Captain Lyle looked uneasy. "All hands on deck," he barked. "Stay sharp." The Crescent Dawn slowed as we approached the ghostly ship. It loomed above us, silent and still, like a monument to something ancient and forgotten. There was no movement on its deck, no sign of life, but the air around it felt charged, as if the ship itself was watching us. "Is that a name on the side?" Matteo whispered. I squinted at the hull and saw faint letters carved into the wood. Endless Voyage. That's impossible, one of the older crew members said, his voice shaking. The Endless Voyage disappeared over 100 years ago. What are you talking about? I asked. He turned to me, his face pale. It was a merchant ship that vanished in the North Atlantic. They say it was cursed, that anyone who sees it is doomed. I wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, but the sight of the ship made it hard to argue. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in our world. Captain Lyle ordered us to keep our distance, but the Endless Voyage seemed to have other plans. As we tried to steer away, the ghost ship moved with us, mirroring our course. No matter how we turned, it remained directly ahead, its lantern casting a steady glow. Full speed ahead, Paul finally said. Let's outrun this thing. The engines roared, and the Crescent Dawn surged forward. For a moment, it seemed like we might escape. The Endless Voyage began to fade into the mist, its lantern growing dimmer. But then, the light flared brighter than ever, blinding us. The ship reappeared directly in our path, impossibly close. The air around it seemed to ripple, and a deep, resonant groan echoed across the water. The crew scrambled to stop the Crescent Dawn, and we came to a shuddering halt just feet from the ghost ship. The groan faded, replaced by a deafening silence. That's when we heard the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the waves, but they grew louder, overlapping in a haunting cacophony. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, angry, desperate. What is that? Matteo stammered. Before anyone could answer, a figure appeared on the deck of the Endless Voyage. It was tall and thin, its form shrouded in mist. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at us. The whispers grew louder, and the water around the Crescent Dawn began to churn. The ship rocked violently, and a cold wind swept across the deck. "We need to get out of here," someone shouted. Captain Lyle didn't hesitate. "Full reverse," he yelled. "Now!" The engines roared to life, and the Crescent Dawn began to back away. But the Endless Voyage followed, its lantern glowing brighter with each passing second. The water churned harder, and the wind howled like a living thing. Just when it seemed like the ghost ship would overtake us, the lantern's light flickered. The figure on the deck lowered its arm, and the whispers faded into silence. The Endless Voyage began to dissolve, its form disintegrating into the mist. Within moments, it was gone. The Crescent Dawn limped back to port, battered but intact. None of us spoke about what had happened, and Captain Lyle warned us not to share the story with anyone. But the crew disbanded soon after, and the Crescent Dawn was sold to another company. I never set foot on a ship again. To this day, I can't explain what we saw that night. The Endless Voyage remains a mystery, its legend whispered among sailors and mariners. Some say it's a warning, a reminder of the ocean's power and the secrets it holds. But I know one thing for certain. When the fog rolls in and the lantern appears, it's best to turn back. Some ships are lost for a reason, and they don't take kindly to being found. I've always believed that the ocean holds more secrets than we'll ever uncover. Growing up near the harbor, I heard countless stories of strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances, ghostly sightings, and inexplicable events at sea. I brushed most of them off as old sailors' tales, entertaining but exaggerated. But last year, I learned just how real those stories could be. It was early autumn when my Uncle Paul invited me to join him aboard his fishing trawler, the Blue Marlin. He needed an extra hand for a week-long expedition to some deeper waters where the bigger catches lurked. As a college student on break, I figured it would be an excellent way to spend time with him and make some money. The trip started smoothly enough. The crew was friendly, the weather was fair, and the catches were promising. But everything changed on the fourth night. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale glow over the calm sea. We were anchored about 50 miles from shore, our nets resting until dawn. Most of the crew had gone to sleep, but I stayed on deck with Paul, enjoying the cool night air and the rhythmic sound of the waves. It was just after midnight when we saw it, a faint light flickering on the horizon. horizon. At first, it looked like the kind of glow you'd see from a distant lighthouse or another vessel. But as it drew closer, the light didn't sway like a lantern on a fishing boat. It was steady, almost like it was floating in the air. "What do you think that is?" I asked. Paul squinted at the light, his expression darkening. "Probably another boat," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. As the light approached, its source became clear. It wasn't a modern vessel. It was a massive sailing ship, its masts towering into the night sky. The hull was blackened, and the sails hung limp, though there was no wind to move them. The ship glided silently over the water, leaving no wake behind it. Paul's face turned pale. "Get below deck," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What? Why?" "Now, Sam, don't ask questions. Just go." Reluctantly, I obeyed, descending the narrow stairs to the cabin. The rest of the crew was awake now, alerted by the sudden tension in Paul's voice. I told them what I'd seen, and their reactions ranged from skepticism to fear. "It's her," one of the older crew members, a wiry man named Jack, whispered. "The silent siren." "The what?" I asked. Jack looked at me, his eyes wide. "It's an old legend, a ghost ship that appears and disappears without a trace. They say she's cursed, crewed by the souls of those lost at sea. Anyone who crosses her path is never the same." Paul came below deck, his face drawn and serious. "Stay here," he ordered. "No one goes topside." We huddled together in the dimly lit cabin, listening to the creak of the Blue Marlin and the faint sound of the waves. But soon, those sounds were drowned out by something else. A haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a woman's voice, soft and mournful, singing a tune that was both beautiful and unsettling. The sound was hypnotic, tugging at something deep inside me. I felt an almost irresistible urge to go to the deck, to find the source of that voice. Jack grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't listen," he hissed. "It's how she gets you." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled over my mind. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I could see that the others were struggling too. Paul stood by the door, his hand on the latch, as if preparing to bolt it. Then, the melody stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the weight of the ocean itself. The air in the cabin felt thick, making it hard to breathe. And then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing as if someone, or something, was walking across the deck above us. Everyone froze, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. The footsteps circled, pausing now and then, as if whoever was up there was searching for something. Or someone. "What do we do?" I whispered. Paul didn't answer. He just motioned for us to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the cabin door rattled. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. The latch held, but the door shook violently, as if an unseen force was determined to break it down. The crew backed away, their faces pale with fear. Jack crossed himself, whispering a prayer under his breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. We stayed where we were, too afraid to move. When the first light of dawn broke through the cabin windows, Paul finally unlocked the door and stepped outside. The rest of us followed hesitantly, unsure of what we'd find. The deck was empty, but something was different. The air felt heavier, and a faint smell of decay lingered. The nets, which had been carefully stowed the night before, were tangled and torn, as if someone, or something, had clawed at them. But the most chilling discovery was the water. Surrounding the Blue Marlin were dozens of floating objects, pieces of wood, tattered sails, and fragments of hulls. It looked like the remains of countless ships, all weathered and blackened, as if they'd been pulled from the depths of the ocean. And then we saw the lantern. It was hanging from the edge of our bow, swaying gently in the breeze. Its flame burned a pale blue, casting an otherworldly glow over the deck. No one dared touch it, and Paul ordered us to leave it alone. We weighed anchor and set course for the nearest port, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had found us that night. But the lantern remained, its eerie glow visible even in daylight. We reached the harbor 2 days later, but the Blue Marlin was never the same. The lantern disappeared the moment we docked, vanishing without a trace. The crew disbanded, unwilling to step foot on the ship again. Paul sold the Blue Marlin soon after, and I returned to the city, vowing never to go back to the sea. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that melody again, soft and mournful, calling to me from the depths of my memory. The ocean keeps its secrets, but it doesn't always keep them buried. The first time I heard the story of the ghost ship in Blackwater Bay, I was just a kid. My father was a fisherman, and I used to sit in the cozy little harbor bar where he would go after long days at sea. The older men in there would tell all sorts of stories, some funny, some sad, and others that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. One story always stuck with me. It was about a ship that no one could quite explain, the Black Lady. According to the story, the Black Lady was a tall, elegant clipper that had been lost to a terrible storm over 50 years ago. The crew had set sail from our town, just a small fishing village back then, on a routine journey across the bay. But the storm that hit was unlike any storm seen before. It tore apart everything in its path, except the ship. The crew of the Black Lady was never found. The ship, along with its cargo and passengers, vanished from all records. Some said it had sunk to the bottom of the bay, but no wreckage was ever found. Others believed it had been taken by some unknown force, leaving no trace behind. But the most chilling part of the tale, the part that always made me feel uneasy, was the rumor that the Black Lady had been cursed, and sometimes, on the stormiest nights, she would reappear on the horizon, silent, glowing, and drifting across the water. It wasn't until years later that I would come face to face with the ghost ship. I was 22 at the time, and had just returned to Blackwater Bay after living away for several years. I'd spent a lot of time working in the city, but something about the peaceful little village always called me back. My father had passed a few years ago, and the thought of reconnecting with my roots felt comforting. That September, I took a job working on a fishing boat. The pay wasn't great, but I figured it would keep me busy and help me forget some of the lingering memories of my father. One evening, while working the late shift with my new crew, the wind began to pick up and the skies turned dark. A storm was coming in, nothing out of the ordinary for the season, but it seemed to be brewing faster than usual. The crew was nervous, especially old Jim, the captain of the boat who had been working these waters for decades. His weathered face grew even more solemn when he looked at the horizon. "We need to get back to port," he said gruffly, steering the boat towards shore. We were halfway back when it happened. The fog rolled in first, thick, heavy, and swallowing everything in its path. The wind howled like an animal trapped in a cage. And then, through the mist, we saw it. A shadow at first, just a faint outline against the swirling fog. But as it got closer, it became clear. It was a ship, a tall, majestic ship with black sails, a sleek, ghostly silhouette that glided across the water with unnatural speed. There were no lights, no sound of a crew working. Just the ship, moving effortlessly through the fog like it was part of the mist itself. I froze, unable to take my eyes off the strange sight. Jim cursed under his breath and slammed his hand on the wheel. "Don't look at it, lad. Just keep your eyes on the water." But it was too late. The Black Lady had already noticed us. The ship moved closer, and I could see that its sails were torn and ragged, flapping eerily in the wind that seemed to be coming from nowhere. The hull of the ship was dark, almost black, and it glistened strangely, like it was wet even though there was no rain. I felt a shiver run through me, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces staring from the portholes. Pale, gaunt faces, their eyes wide with fear and longing. The air grew colder, and the once faint sound of the wind began to shift into a low, mournful whistle, like the ship was singing a haunting melody. "Is it real?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jim's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "It's real, all right. Too real. Don't ever speak of it." The ship kept getting closer. There was no escape, not with the storm closing in and the mist thickening around us. I could barely see the crew on board the Black Lady, just shadows moving about on the deck as though they were caught in a loop. repeating their actions over and over again. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, as if the very presence of the ship had drained the warmth from the air around us. My heart raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to run, but I couldn't. The ship had us in its grip, and we were drifting closer by the second. Suddenly, the fog seemed to lift just enough for me to see the ship's bow, where I saw something that made my blood run cold. A woman stood at the front, her long, flowing hair billowing in the wind, her white gown almost glowing in the dim light. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was staring directly at me. A feeling of dread washed over me, the kind I had never experienced before. It was as though she could see into my very soul, as though she knew my deepest fears and regrets. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew what she was saying. "Come to me." It was the voice of the siren, the legend from my childhood. I had heard the stories, but never thought them to be true. Now, standing on that boat, with the Black Lady looming before us, I knew that the legends were real, and that we had come too close to the ship. Before I could respond, Jim pulled me away from the edge of the boat, pushing me toward the cabin. "Get inside, now." I stumbled as the boat lurched, the waves crashing higher, the storm intensifying. We weren't just in a normal storm anymore. The sea was alive, angry, as though it was fighting to keep us from leaving. I watched through the porthole as the Black Lady came closer, the ghostly figure of the woman still standing at the bow. She raised her arms, and the ship seemed to react to her movement. The wind howled louder, the water churned, and the boat shuddered as though it were caught in the grip of something powerful, something beyond our understanding. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the ship vanished. The fog closed in around us, and the storm seemed to pass as if it had never been there. The sea calmed, and the air grew warm once again. Jim was standing by the helm, his face pale and drawn. "That," he said hoarsely, "was the Black Lady. You've seen her now." I nodded, unable to speak. The memory of the ship, the woman, and the feeling of her gaze haunted me in the days that followed. We made it back to the harbor safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. For days, I could hear the soft sound of singing on the wind, faint but persistent, just like the siren's call. Jim never spoke of that night again. The crew disbanded quickly, and the boat was sold off to another captain. But I'll never forget what I saw. The Black Lady was real, and sometimes, when the storm clouds gather and the fog rolls in, I swear I can still see her, gliding silently across the water. Her crew, forever trapped in time, drifting through the endless ocean in search of something they can never find. And I know one thing for certain. If you're ever near Blackwater Bay, on a dark, stormy night, and you hear the soft sound of a woman's song carried on the wind, don't look for the source, because the Black Lady may just be looking for you. I never believed in ghost ships. That's what I used to think, at least. The myths and ghost stories passed down by old sailors and fishermen seemed like just that, stories. Tall tales told to frighten children or amuse the drunken men down at the harbor. But that was before the night I saw the fleet. It was early spring, and I had just finished my shift at the local marina, a quiet spot along the coast where the boats came and went like clockwork. I was working as a deckhand on a small charter boat called the Sea Breeze, taking tourists out for fishing trips and scenic tours of the coastline. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept me close to the ocean, something I loved more than anything. That particular night, the weather was calm, the kind of stillness that makes the sea look like a mirror, reflecting the stars above. It was a peaceful evening, and after cleaning up from a late tour, I was about to head home when I noticed something strange. There was a ship off in the distance, its silhouette faint but unmistakable against the starry sky. At first, I thought it was just a fishing boat returning to port, but as I looked closer, I realized something was off. The ship wasn't moving the way it should. It glided across the water with no visible wake, no sound of a motor, just a silent presence, looming in the distance. I shrugged it off. Probably just some old boat, I muttered to myself, but deep down, something about it unsettled me. Then, the next night, it happened again. This time, I was on the Sea Breeze with a small group of tourists. We were anchored just outside the bay, enjoying the quiet evening, when the same strange sight appeared on the horizon. The ship wasn't the same one I had seen the night before, but it was just as eerie. The same ghostly quality, silent, motionless, almost as if it were suspended in time. I tried to explain it away as a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had heard the rumors from the older fishermen down at the docks, stories of ghost ships that sailed the waters off our coast, appearing only at night and vanishing without a trace. They were called the Vanishing Fleet, a group of ships that had disappeared during a massive storm over a century ago, their crews lost to the sea. Some said they were cursed, doomed to sail forever, never to find peace. I had dismissed these stories, but now, standing on the deck of the Sea Breeze, I wasn't so sure. The ship appeared again, its dark silhouette outlined by the pale moonlight. This time, it was closer. I could make out the details, the tattered sails, the weathered hull, the broken mast, and I could hear it now. The faint sound of creaking wood, the groan of the ship as if it were alive. A chill ran down my spine. "Captain, there's something out there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Captain Gregson, a grizzled old man who had worked these waters for years, squinted into the distance. His face, usually stern and composed, shifted into an expression of concern. "Don't look at it, son," he muttered, his voice low. "Just don't." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "The Vanishing Fleet," he said quietly. "It's real, and if you're unlucky enough to see them, they'll come for you." That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the ship lingered in my mind, its ghostly figure drifting across the water like a forgotten dream. I knew I had to find out more. I couldn't just ignore it and pretend it was some trick of the mind. I met Captain Gregson at the marina the next morning, hoping to get more answers. He was already at the dock, preparing his boat for the day's run. The marina was quiet, most of the fishermen still sleeping off their late-night shifts. "Captain, what do you know about the Vanishing Fleet?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gregson stopped what he was doing and looked at me, his weathered face serious. "You shouldn't be asking questions about that, boy. Trust me, there are some things better left unknown." "But I saw it. I saw one of the ships," I insisted. Gregson sighed, wiping his hands on a rag before turning to face me fully. "All right, listen up. This is something I don't like talking about, but I'll tell you. Years ago, a fleet of ships set sail from this very harbor. They were heading for the open ocean, bound for new lands, new opportunities. But something happened. They were caught in a storm unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And in the blink of an eye, the fleet was gone. Not a single ship was ever found. People said the crews had perished, but I don't believe that. Some say the ships vanished into another dimension. Others say they were cursed by a vengeful spirit of the sea. Whatever happened, they never returned." He paused, looking out across the bay, as if lost in the memory. "But once every year, on a night like tonight, the fleet appears again. They sail the waters, waiting for someone to take them back. And when they do, they come for the living." "Do you think the ships are cursed?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I don't know. All I know is that I've seen them. And every time I've seen one, someone's disappeared, gone without a trace. Sometimes the ship just vanishes in the fog. Sometimes it drifts closer, and you hear the crew. If you listen closely enough, you can hear their voices. They beg for help. But if you get too close, you're lost too." I shivered at the thought. "We've lost good men to those ships," Gregson continued. "Men who thought they could survive the curse. But no one survives once they get too close." That night, I could hardly sit still. The feeling of dread had settled over me like a heavy fog, and I couldn't shake it. I had to know what the ships wanted. I had to find out what happened to them. As the evening wore on, the wind began to pick up, and the sea grew restless. The clouds gathered, casting a shadow over the bay. It was the perfect night for the Vanishing Fleet to return. I took a small boat out into the water, armed only with a flashlight and the fear gnawing at my insides. The sea was choppy, the waves crashing against the sides of the boat, but I kept going. I had to know. And then, just like before, I saw it. The silhouette of the ship moving across the water with eerie silence. This time, it was closer. I could see the details, the broken mast, the tattered sails, the ghostly figures standing on the deck. They were there, just like in the stories, frozen in time. I couldn't turn away. The ship seemed to draw me in, its presence so powerful that I felt as if I had no choice but to approach it. I was close now, too close, and that's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, whispers carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder. They were calling out to me, pleading for help. Help us, please. We're trapped on the ship. I felt my heart race as I turned to look at the crew, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They reached out to me, their hands trembling as if begging for salvation. I knew in that moment what they wanted. They wanted me to join them. They wanted to take me with them, to become a part of the crew, to drift forever on the waters with no end. The ship was too close now, and I could feel the pull of the curse wrapping around me. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could almost hear their voices in my mind, like a drowning man reaching for the surface. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the ship was gone. The mist rolled in, and the water calmed. I was alone in the boat, my hands gripping the oars, my heart still pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the ship, no trace of the crew. I made my way back to shore as quickly as I could, the echoes of their voices still ringing in my ears. The next morning, when I returned to the marina, I learned that a fellow fisherman had gone missing overnight. No one knew where he'd gone, but I knew. I knew that the vanishing fleet had taken him, just as it had taken so many others before. And now, I knew the truth. The ghost ships weren't just legends. They were real. And once you saw them, they would never leave you. They would haunt you, calling you back to the sea, until the day you vanished like all the others. So, if you ever find yourself by the water, and you see a ship out there, drifting in the mist, silent and alone, don't look too closely, because once you do, you might never return. The first time I saw the ghost ship, I didn't believe it was real. It was a few years ago, in the summer, during a trip to Cape Hollow, a small coastal town with a long history of mysterious disappearances and strange events. I had heard the old stories, tales of a ship that appeared out of nowhere, only to disappear just as quickly, leaving behind only whispers in the wind. But like most young people, I thought they were just stories, exaggerated by the imagination of old fishermen and storytellers. I was 24 at the time, working as a summer intern at a local marine research lab. My days were spent studying the coastline and its wildlife, but at night, I liked to walk along the shore, taking in the salty air and watching the dark waters stretch out into the horizon. It was on one of these walks that I first encountered the ghost ship. It was a warm evening, and the air smelled of brine and seaweed. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the ocean. I had walked further out than usual that evening, drawn by a sense of curiosity. The night had settled in, and the fog had begun to roll in from the sea, covering the bay in a thick, white blanket. The air grew chillier, and the familiar sounds of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed muffled by the fog. As I walked along the rocky coastline, I noticed something strange. At first, it was barely visible through the fog, a dark shape on the water, moving slowly and silently. It looked like a ship, but something about it didn't feel right. There were no lights on it, no sound of an engine, just a dark outline drifting across the water. I paused, squinting into the mist, trying to make out the shape. Then, as if responding to my gaze, the ship shifted, and I could make out the silhouette more clearly. It had large, tattered sails that billowed despite the lack of wind, and a ghostly glow that seemed to emanate from its wooden hull. The ship was old, far older than any vessel I had seen before. It was like something from another time, an apparition pulled from the past and anchored in the present. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away. The ship drifted closer, as though drawn to me. I could hear a faint creaking sound, the kind you hear when old wood is under strain. It was unsettling, like the ship was alive in some way, moving not by the force of the ocean, but by some unseen hand. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on my mind. But then, the ship grew closer still, and I realized that it was not an illusion. It was real. I had heard the rumors, of course. People talked about the ghost ship of Cape Hollow, a vessel that had been lost during a fierce storm more than 100 years ago. The legend went that the ship, the Aurora, had sailed out into the storm with a full crew and a cargo hold brimming with treasures. But when the storm had passed, there had been no sign of the Aurora. No wreckage, no survivors, nothing. It was as if the ship and its crew had simply vanished. The townspeople said that the ship had been cursed, and every year, on the anniversary of its disappearance, it would return. The ghost ship would sail through the fog, its sails billowing in the wind, looking for its lost crew. Some said that the ship would appear only to those brave, or foolish, enough to venture out into the fog at night. Others said that if you saw the ship, it meant that you would never be seen again. I had always dismissed the story as superstition. After all, there was a logical explanation for everything, right? Fog could play tricks on the eyes, and the mind was a powerful thing, capable of creating hallucinations. But now, as I watched the ship draw closer, I wasn't so sure anymore. I felt a strange chill creeping over me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The ship moved soundlessly through the water, its sails fluttering in the still night air. There was no mistaking it now. It was real, and it was right there, in front of me. The faint creaking of the wood was the only sound, as though the ship were moving in the world of the living yet trapped in the realm of the dead. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. The ship was almost close enough for me to see the details on its deck, but I dared not get any closer. The glow that surrounded it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and I felt as though I were being pulled toward it, like a moth drawn to a flame. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. It was a woman's voice, soft and mournful. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a sadness to it, a longing that sent shivers through my spine. Before I could react, the ship suddenly lurched, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the fog. One moment it was there, just a few yards away from the shore, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the mist. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but there was nothing. No ship, no glow, no sound. Just the thick, suffocating fog. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Had it been a dream? A trick of the light? Or had it been something more? That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the ghostly ship haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. The next day, I spoke to some of the local fishermen, hoping to find an explanation. Old Man Henry, a lifelong resident of Cape Hollow, was the first to offer any insight. When I asked about the ghost ship, he looked at me with weary eyes, as if he had heard my question 1,000 times before. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice rough from years of salt and wind. I nodded. "What is it? What happened to it?" Henry let out a long sigh, wiping his hand across his face. "The Aurora. It was a fine ship, back in its day. It was carrying a load of treasure when it disappeared in the storm. But the sea doesn't let go of its debts so easily. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, the ship comes back, and every time, someone new sees it, someone who might never return. Some say the ship's cursed, that it's doomed to sail forever, searching for its crew. Some say it's trying to find the treasure it lost. Do people disappear?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. Henry's eyes narrowed, his face growing darker. "Every year, someone sees the ship, and every year, someone vanishes. No one knows where they go, but they never come back. There's something about that ship, something unnatural. People say the souls of the crew still haunt the waters, and if you get too close, you might join them." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The thought of being pulled into the sea, lost to the depths with the ship and its crew, made my stomach churn. That night, I decided to go back to the shore, determined to uncover the truth. I couldn't explain why I felt so drawn to the ship, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important I needed to learn. I walked along the same stretch of coastline, the fog thick around me, swallowing the world in its damp embrace. And as I had feared, the ship appeared once again. This time, it was closer. I could hear the faint sound of voices, low, murmuring whispers carried on the wind. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, my body frozen in place. I could see the crew now, their faces pale and ghostly, their eyes empty and lost. They seemed to move in slow motion, as if they were stuck in time, doomed to repeat the same actions over and over again. The woman's voice returned, clearer now, calling to me from the ship. "Help us. Join us. Forever." I felt my breath catch in my throat. The voice was like a siren's call, pulling me toward the ship, toward the endless depths of the sea. I couldn't resist. I took a step forward, but then, as if the ship had heard my thoughts, it began to drift away, vanishing into the fog once more, leaving me standing on the shore, staring into the empty sea. The ship was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered. I knew, then, that it wasn't just a legend. The Aurora was real, and it would continue to return, year after year, pulling the curious and the brave into its cursed orbit. I left Cape Hollow the next morning, but I knew I would never forget the ship. Every time I think about it, I wonder if it will come for me again, if I will ever hear that voice calling me from the depths of the sea. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I swear I can see the faint outline of the ship on the horizon, drifting silently through the mist, waiting for the next soul to answer its call. When I first came to Oak Bay, I never thought I'd encounter anything more eerie than a few local legends. A quiet fishing village nestled between rugged cliffs and dark waters, the place had an air of mystery to it, but most of that came from the stories passed down by the old-timers at the docks. They talked about things that seemed too strange to believe, ghost ships that appeared and vanished, sailors lost without a trace, and curses tied to the sea. But, like most people, I dismissed them as just that, stories. I was fresh out of college, looking for a quiet summer job, and found work at a small boat rental company on the edge of the bay. The owner, Mr. Lawson, was a weathered man in his late 60s, with a thick beard and hands that seemed to have seen every kind of weather the sea could throw at them. He didn't talk much about the supernatural. The only thing he cared about was making sure the boats were in good condition and that the tourists paid up. "You ever hear about the Black Dawn?" Mr. Lawson asked me one evening after I finished my shift. He was sitting on the dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I had just finished locking up the boats for the night and was about to head to my small apartment above the shop. "The Black Dawn?" I asked, feeling a slight chill in the air as I sat down next to him. "Aye," he nodded. "That's what they call the ghost ship that haunts these waters. It's been seen off and on for decades. Some say it's been around for centuries." I raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that just an old legend? You know, the kind of thing they tell the tourists?" Mr. Lawson looked at me with a somber expression. "It's more than a legend, son. I've seen it myself, and so have others. It's no ordinary ship. The Black Dawn. She doesn't follow the rules of the sea." The way he said it made me uneasy. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well," Mr. Lawson began, staring out at the sea, his eyes narrowing, "the Black Dawn isn't like other ships. She doesn't sail when the sun's up, only in the dark of night. And she always comes from the north, out of the fog. No one knows what happened to her, but some say she went down in a terrible storm 100 years ago. It was carrying a load of precious cargo, but it never made it back. The ship just disappeared." I shifted uneasily. But if the ship sank, how could it come back? "That's the question, isn't it?" Mr. Lawson said, his voice low. "They say the ship's cursed. Every year, on the night of the storm's anniversary, the Black Dawn sails again. She comes out of the mist, silent and ominous, and anyone who sees her disappears without a trace." I laughed, trying to brush it off, but the way he spoke made me feel like there was something more to it. "It sounds like something out of a movie." But it's real," Mr. Lawson said with a grim smile. "Trust me, if you're ever out on the water late at night, keep your eyes peeled for her. And if you see her, don't go near her. If she spots you, you won't come back." No one ever has. I tried to forget the conversation with Mr. Lawson, but the thought of the Black Dawn lingered in my mind. The old man's words stuck with me, gnawing at my thoughts every time I walked along the docks at night. I was skeptical, of course. Ghost ships? Cursed vessels from the past? It all sounded a little too far-fetched for my liking. But then, one fateful night, I found myself out on the water, far beyond the safety of the bay. It was a calm evening, clear skies above, with only a hint of fog rolling in from the north. I had been out on a small boat, guiding a few tourists back to shore after a late-night fishing trip. I dropped them off at the dock and then decided to take the boat out for a solo ride, enjoying the solitude of the open water. As I drifted further away from the shore, the fog began to grow thicker. The air turned cooler, and the sounds of the night grew muffled. The only thing I could hear was the gentle lapping of the waves against the boat. It was peaceful, almost serene, but that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, a faint outline against the mist. I thought it was another boat, perhaps a fisherman heading back to shore. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't like any boat I had ever seen before. The ship was tall, with towering masts that reached toward the heavens. Its sails were dark, almost black, and they seemed to flutter in the wind despite there being no breeze. The hull was ancient-looking, weathered and decayed, as though it had been trapped in time for centuries. It was moving toward me, slowly but steadily, without a sound. I froze. My heart started to race, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The ship wasn't supposed to be here. No one sailed this far out at night, especially not in the fog. And this ship was far older than anything I had seen. It drifted closer, its ghostly presence sending shivers through my entire body. I wanted to turn back, to head for the shore, but my legs wouldn't move. The ship was too mesmerizing, too haunting, like it was calling me closer, pulling me into its dark embrace. Then, I heard it, a voice, soft, barely audible, but clear as day. It came from the ship, floating on the air like a whisper from another world. "Come aboard." I snapped out of my trance, my breath coming in short gasps. What was I thinking? There was no way I was going near that ship. I wasn't some fool who would fall for some old ghostly trick. I grabbed the throttle of the boat, ready to turn and race back to the safety of the shore. But before I could do anything, the ship was right next to me. It didn't appear to move toward me, but somehow, it had closed the distance with unnatural speed. I could now see the details of the ship's deck. The sails were torn, and the wood of the hull seemed rotten, as if it had been abandoned for decades. And then I saw them. Figures. Shadowy forms standing motionless on the deck. They weren't moving, just standing there, their faces obscured by the dark mist that seemed to hang around them. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their eyes on me. Cold, empty eyes that stared into my soul. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the sides of the boat, knuckles white, but I couldn't take my eyes off the ship. It was like I was frozen, unable to move, unable to escape. Then, the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Come aboard. Join us." I tried to turn the boat around, but the engine sputtered. It was as if the ship had somehow drained all the power from my motor, leaving me stranded in the water, helpless. I reached for the paddle, but before I could do anything, the fog thickened even more, engulfing everything in its icy grip. The ship was gone. One moment it was there, looming over me like a dark omen, and the next, it had vanished into the mist. I blinked, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the oars, desperately paddling back toward the shore. The fog didn't clear immediately, but I could feel the weight of it lifting as I made my way toward the bay. When I finally reached the dock, I was shaking uncontrollably. The boat seemed to sway under my feet, as if it had never been solid to begin with. I didn't speak to anyone when I got back. I just locked up the boat and went inside, hoping to put the strange encounter out of my mind. But the next morning, when I went to check the boat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, scratched into the side of the hull, was a message. "Join us." I haven't told anyone about what happened that night. Mr. Lawson still speaks of the Black Dawn in hushed tones, warning others to stay away. And I've stayed away from the water after dark, But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the night seems too quiet, I swear I can hear the sound of creaking wood, and I wonder if the ship will come back. They say the Black Dawn is cursed, that it drags the souls of the living into its dark depths. And now, I know that it's true. Once you see the ship, it never truly lets you go. I had always thought the ocean was a place of beauty and peace, a vast, untamable stretch of blue that whispered of freedom and adventure. But after spending a year living on the edge of Windward Bay, I came to realize that the sea is not just a serene force. It is a place of shadows, of forgotten stories, and of things that should never have been allowed to drift into legend. My name is Jack Ralston, and I had moved to Windward Bay after landing a job as a marine biologist. The bay was a quiet, sleepy place, surrounded by jagged cliffs and thick forests. It was one of those towns where everyone knew each other's name, and most people had lived there their whole lives. The town was beautiful, with weather-beaten cottages, rocky shores, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs at night. But there was something else beneath the surface, something darker. I had first heard about the ghost ship shortly after moving in. Old men at the local tavern spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting around as if to make sure no one else could hear. They called it the Lady of the Mist, a ship that appeared out of nowhere in the fog and vanished just as quickly, leaving nothing behind but the faint sound of eerie whispers carried by the wind. I was skeptical, of course. Ghosts? A phantom ship? These things were far from my realm of belief. But as time passed, the stories began to chip away at my rational mind. The first time I encountered the ghost ship, I didn't realize what it was until it was far too late. It was an early morning in mid-July, and I had just finished a late-night study session at the lab. I decided to take a walk down to the docks to clear my head. The town was quiet, the only sound being the gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden piers. The fog was thick that morning, rolling off the sea like a blanket, swallowing up everything in its path. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and made my way down to the water. The dock was empty, save for a few boats gently rocking in their moorings. I breathed in the cool, salty air, the mist clinging to my skin, and leaned over the edge of the pier, staring into the gray depths below. I don't know what drew my attention to it at first. Maybe it was the way the fog swirled around the edges of the bay, or perhaps it was the strange sense that I wasn't alone. And then I saw it. A shape appeared through the mist, slowly coming into focus. At first, I thought it was another boat, but this was different. The ship was large, with tattered sails that seemed to move despite the stillness of the air. Its hull was dark, almost black, with a weathered, decaying look to it. The ship drifted silently, moving against the current as though powered by something unseen. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The ship was too large to be one of the local fishing boats, and it didn't seem to belong here at all. I stepped back, my mind racing. The stories, the ones I had dismissed as nonsense, could they be true? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the ship as it came closer, its figure becoming clearer and more detailed. There was no sound, no engine, no creak of wood, just the silence and the unnatural way it glided toward me. Then, something strange happened. The ship seemed to pause for a moment, as if it were waiting. I could barely make out shapes on the deck, figures, standing motionless. I couldn't tell if they were people or shadows, their forms too indistinct in the fog. Suddenly, I heard it, a voice, soft and low, carried by the wind. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't a voice that felt like it belonged to a living person. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, as though it had traveled from the depths of time. "Help us." The words were faint, almost a whisper, but they were clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I instinctively took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. Was I hearing things? No, I knew what I had heard. I turned quickly, ready to leave, but the ship was right there, just a few feet away from the dock. It had closed the distance without making a sound, as though it had been watching me. My legs froze in place, unable to move. The ship's dark silhouette loomed above me, its sails fluttering as though in a ghostly wind. The figure on the deck, the one closest to me, stepped forward, and I could see that it was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her features were pale, almost translucent, and her long, flowing hair seemed to sway in a wind that wasn't there. Her eyes were wide, empty, staring into mine, and her mouth moved as if trying to speak, but no words came. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my feet glued to the dock. The woman's gaze seemed to pull me in, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, without warning, the ship began to fade. It wasn't like it simply sailed away. It dissolved into the mist, the sails and the hull vanishing as though they had never been there at all. In an instant, it was gone. The fog swallowed it whole, and I was left standing alone on the dock, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty water, waiting for the ship to return, but it didn't. The fog began to lift, the early morning sun breaking through the mist, and the world seemed to return to normal. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it been a hallucination brought on by fatigue? But when I looked at the dock, I saw something that confirmed what I had just experienced was real. There, on the wooden planks, were footprints. Wet, muddy prints leading from the edge of the dock to where I had been standing. They were small, like the footprints of someone who had stepped out of the water, but there had been no one else around. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened that morning, not right away. I tried to convince myself that I had just seen things, that I had been tired, or that the fog had played tricks on me. But the memory of the ship and of that woman's ghostly stare haunted me for days. As the weeks went by, I began to hear more stories from the locals, stories of the Lady of the Mist. It was an old tale, passed down through generations, about a ship that had vanished into the fog more than 100 years ago. The story said that the ship was a trading vessel, and it had been caught in a terrible storm off the coast of Windward Bay. The storm had destroyed the ship, and all its passengers had drowned, their bodies lost to the sea. But that wasn't the end of the story. No, the ship didn't truly sink. It was cursed, bound to the fog, and once a year, on the anniversary of its disappearance, the ship would return. It would sail through the mist, silently appearing and disappearing, and anyone who saw it would be doomed to join the crew in death. At first, I didn't believe it. After all, it was just an old story, right? But then I learned something strange. There were people in town who had seen the ship, more than once. People who swore they had heard the voice, the same haunting whisper I had heard. And, like me, they had been left with strange, inexplicable signs. The footprints, the eerie sense of being watched, the cold air that accompanied the ship's appearance. It was the following autumn when I saw her again. This time, I was out on the water, collecting samples for my research. The fog had rolled in thick and heavy, cloaking the bay in a ghostly silence. I had just finished taking measurements when I saw the ship again, drifting toward me through the mist. The Lady of the Mist. I knew, deep down, that I had no business being out there, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't look away. The ship came closer, its dark sails billowing in the fog, and I heard the voice again. Closer this time. Help us. The woman's figure appeared on the deck once more, her eyes still hollow, her face a mask of sorrow. And this time, she spoke to me, her voice a chilling, mournful cry that seemed to cut through the very air. You must join us. You must. The ship began to fade, its form dissolving into the mist, just as it had done before. But this time, I knew something for certain. The Lady of the Mist was not just a ship. She was a curse, a prison for the souls of the lost, and I had become part of her story. I don't know how many times I've seen the ship now. I've lost count, but I've learned to stay away from the water at night, to avoid the fog when it rolls in. Because once you see the Lady of the Mist, you're never truly free from her haunting call. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it too. The whisper carried on the wind, calling you to join the crew of the phantom vessel. I used to think I was just like any other guy. I lived a simple life in a small coastal town, worked as a mechanic, and spent most of my free time on the water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel like I was where I belonged. However, everything changed the night I came across the ghost ship. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just finished a long day of work at the shop. My brother, Tom, and I decided to head out for a late-night fishing trip. The weather was calm, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow across the water. We rented a small boat from the marina and made our way out toward Blackwater Cove, a spot known for its quiet solitude and, as some of the locals whispered, strange occurrences. I had heard the stories. Everyone had. They were the kind of tales that got passed around over drinks. Stories about a phantom ship that would appear out of nowhere, always on the darkest nights, and vanish just as quickly. It was said to be the Blackwater Spectre, a ghost ship that had been cursed for centuries. According to the rumors, anyone who saw it would either disappear or meet a terrible fate. I had always dismissed these stories as nothing more than local folklore. After all, I was a man of reason, a mechanic, someone who fixed things with my hands and solved problems with logic. Ghost ships? That was just nonsense. We were about an hour out when the fog started to roll in. At first, it was a thin veil, but it quickly thickened, shrouding the bay in a ghostly mist. The water became eerily quiet, and the usual sounds of seagulls and the rustling of the trees on the shore were swallowed by the fog. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just our boat and the thickening haze around us. "Feels like we're in a horror movie," Tom joked, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He had always been the superstitious one between the two of us, the kind of guy who wouldn't walk under ladders or open an umbrella indoors. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just fog. We're fine." But even I had to admit, there was something unsettling about the silence. The air was thick and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That's when we heard it, a sound in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder. It was the unmistakable sound of a ship's bell ringing, its tone deep and mournful, echoing through the fog. Tom stiffened beside me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, trying to make sense of it. There were no other boats out here, no ships in the cove. The sound should have been impossible, but it kept coming, closer now, the bell tolling with each passing second. It was a low, hollow sound, one that seemed to stir something deep inside me, something ancient and unsettling. And then we saw it. Through the dense fog, a shape emerged, a massive vessel, its sails tattered and dark against the gray mist. It appeared out of nowhere, as if it had materialized from the very air itself. The ship was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was old, far older than any ship I had ever encountered, with a black hull that gleamed in the dim moonlight. The sails hung limp, their fabric torn and frayed. But it wasn't the ship itself that terrified me. It was the crew. There were figures standing on the deck, but they weren't like any men I had ever seen. They were tall, gaunt, their features twisted and obscured by the fog. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their movements were slow, deliberate, like they were moving through water instead of air. There were no sounds of footsteps, no creaking of the ship's boards, just the deep, mournful ringing of the bell, growing louder with each passing second. "Jack, what is that?" Tom's voice was barely above a whisper, his face pale in the moonlight. I don't know," I replied, my own voice trembling. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn the boat around and get out of there. But I couldn't. We were frozen in place, unable to look away from the ship as it loomed closer, its silhouette growing larger with each passing moment. As the ship drew near, I could feel a strange pressure in the air, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. The fog seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped, sending a chill through my bones. The figures on the ship were now clearer, their eyes fixed on us, their faces pale and lifeless, like corpses that had been pulled from the depths of the sea. Their hands were raised, as if beckoning us forward. "Tom, we need to leave." "Now," I said, my voice urgent, but it was too late. The ship stopped moving, its massive hull hovering just a few feet from our boat. It didn't rock or sway in the water. It simply sat there, motionless, as though it was waiting for something. The bells stopped tolling, and all that remained was a profound silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, as if on cue, the fog began to recede, slowly pulling back like a curtain. In the sudden clarity, I could see that the ship was gone. Just like that. One moment, it was there, looming over us, and the next, it had vanished, swallowed by the night and the mist. We were left alone on the water, surrounded by nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the gentle lapping of the waves against the side of the boat. Tom and I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us able to speak, too frightened to even look at each other. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had we imagined it? Had we both been hallucinating? Finally, Tom broke the silence. "We need to go back," he said, his voice shaky. "Now." I nodded, my hands trembling as I grabbed the oars. We didn't speak another word as I rowed the boat back toward the shore, the fog slowly lifting as we neared the land. By the time we reached the dock, the night was clear, the moon shining brightly overhead. There was no sign of the ship, no trace of the strange figures that had stood on its deck. But as I tied up the boat and we stepped onto the dock, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the sand, were footprints, wet, as if someone had just walked through them. But there was no one around, no sign of anyone who could have left them behind. Tom didn't say anything as we walked back to our truck. He didn't have to. The fear was written all over his face. I could feel it too. The thing we had seen out there, whatever it was, had not been a hallucination. It had been real. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ship again, drifting silently through the fog, its crew waiting, watching. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. Tom and I didn't go out to Blackwater Cove again. We didn't talk about what happened, either. It was like an unspoken agreement between us, one that we both kept to ourselves. But I couldn't forget the Blackwater Spectre, the ghost ship that had appeared out of nowhere and vanished without a trace. And then, one evening, several months later, I heard the bell again. It was faint at first, like a distant echo carried on the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. I walked down to the shore, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog had rolled in again, thick and suffocating, and in the distance, I saw it. The ship, the Blackwater Spectre. I don't know how many times I've seen it now, or how many more times it will appear, but I know one thing for certain. Once you see the Blackwater Spectre, you can never truly escape it. It will always be out there, waiting for you, just beyond the fog. I never believed in ghost stories. Growing up in a small fishing town on the coast, I was used to hearing about all sorts of bizarre happenings. The strange creature sightings, the eerie lights over the water at night, and of course, the ghost ships. People in the town would tell tales of ships lost at sea, their crews swallowed by the waves, doomed to return from the fog year after year. But I always thought it was just folklore. Stories meant to spook kids and make the old-timers sound wise. That all changed on a foggy evening in October, when I came face to face with one of those ghost ships. My name's Sean, and I'm a fisherman by trade. I've lived my entire life in the coastal town of Misty Point, a sleepy place where the sea stretches out as far as the eye can see. The town isn't much, just a few cottages, a small harbor, and a fishing pier that's seen better days. But it's home, and I've always found peace there, even when the town's legends started to get under my skin. The most famous legend in Misty Point is that of the Serena, a ship that disappeared during a terrible storm over 100 years ago. The ship was said to have been carrying precious cargo, gold, silver, and other valuables, and the crew was never found. The only thing that remained of the ship was the bell, which was later found on the shore, covered in barnacles, its sound still faintly echoing through the cliffs on quiet nights. After that, people claimed to have seen the Serena sailing out of the fog, its ghostly form drifting silently over the waves. I thought it was all a bunch of nonsense. Ships don't come back from the dead. At least, that's what I told myself. One evening, after a long day of hauling and fish, I decided to take my boat out for a quick spin. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted with deep purples and pinks, casting an otherworldly glow over the water. The breeze was light, the sea calm, and the waves barely lapped at the boat as I steered it out beyond the harbor. As I drifted farther from the shore, the fog began to roll in. It wasn't unusual for Misty Point to have fog in the evenings, but tonight, it seemed heavier than usual. It crept over the water like a living thing, swallowing the world around me in its damp embrace. The visibility quickly dropped, and the shore seemed to vanish completely behind me. I wasn't concerned at first. I had navigated these waters hundreds of times, and I knew the area well. I figured I'd wait out the fog before heading back, but as the minutes stretched on, I began to feel uneasy. The air grew colder, and the silence that surrounded me was deafening. The usual sounds of seagulls and the distant hum of the harbor were gone, replaced by an eerie quietness. It felt as if the entire world had been muted. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like a bell tolling from far away. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but as the fog thickened, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of a ship's bell, I thought. No, it was too haunting, too mournful. It was the sound of a bell ringing for something lost, something that would never return. And then, just as suddenly as the sound began, I saw it. Through the fog, a shape began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, but it quickly became clearer. A massive ship, its sails billowing in the wind, though there was no wind to speak of. The ship was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its hull was dark, nearly black, and its sails were torn, fluttering in the non-existent breeze. The ship moved silently through the fog, as if it were gliding, its wooden frame creaking and groaning with every passing second. I stared in disbelief, my mind racing. Was this real? The ship didn't look like any fishing vessel I had ever seen. It was ancient, as though it had been pulled from the depths of time itself. The bell rang again, louder now, and I could see the faint outline of figures on the deck. Tall, thin figures, moving slowly and deliberately, their features hidden by shadows. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I knew they weren't alive. God, no. I whispered to myself. This couldn't be happening. I instinctively reached for the throttle, ready to turn my boat around and race back to the harbor. But before I could do anything, the ship was upon me, its massive hull looming above my boat, its sails brushing the mist like gossamer. The figures on deck stood motionless, staring straight ahead as if they didn't see me. Or maybe they did, but they didn't care. The bell tolled once more, louder now, and a chill ran through me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the ship, drawn in by something I couldn't explain. The ship drifted closer, its silent presence suffocating me, and I could hear something. A voice, faint at first, but growing clearer. Help us. It was a woman's voice, soft and desperate, carried by the wind. My blood ran cold. I had to get away. I had to move, but my body wouldn't listen. I was paralyzed, caught in the ship's haunting gaze. The fog around me thickened, and the ship seemed to draw closer, the figures on deck now clearly visible, ghostly, transparent, their eyes empty and lifeless. The woman's voice came again, a tortured whisper this time. Help us, we are lost. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't take my eyes off the ship. It was like a terrible dream, one I couldn't wake up from. The bell rang once more, louder than before, and then, without warning, the ship began to fade. The fog parted, and in an instant, the Sirena was gone, as if it had never been there. The water was still again, the air lighter, as though the oppressive weight of the ship had never existed. The fog continued to swirl around me, but there was no sign of the vessel, no sound of the bell, nothing. I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination, a trick of the fog, or had I really seen a ghost ship? But the questions didn't matter. I had seen it with my own eyes, and I knew what I had experienced was real. The Sirena was no mere legend. It was out there, somewhere, drifting in the fog, waiting for someone to see it again. After what seemed like hours, I finally gathered enough strength to turn the boat around. I made my way back to the harbor in a daze, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I reached the dock, I didn't even bother tying the boat. I just got out and ran, as fast as I could, back to my small cottage on the outskirts of town. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ship again. The Sirena, gliding silently through the mist, its crew waiting on the deck, their hollow eyes watching me. I tried to tell myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that it was the fog playing tricks on me, but I knew better. The next morning, I went down to the docks, hoping to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. But when I arrived, there was something waiting for me. It was a ship's bell, lying on the ground near the water's edge, covered in rust and barnacles. It looked ancient, worn by time, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same bell I had heard the night before. I don't know what the Sirena wanted, or why it chose to reveal itself to me. I don't know if it was trying to warn me, or if it was simply seeking someone to hear its story. All I know is that it's out there, still drifting through the fog, its ghostly crew waiting for the next soul to see them. Now, whenever the fog rolls in thick over the bay, I don't go out on the water. I can't. I've seen what lies beneath that mist, and I've learned that some legends are best left undisturbed. But if you ever find yourself in Misty Point, and you hear a bell tolling in the fog, don't go looking for it. Because if you do, you might find the Sirena, and once you see it, you can never forget it. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear the voices of the lost crew, calling out to you across the water, "Help us." I've lived by the sea my whole life, in a town called Hollow Bay, known for its eerie calm waters and mist-covered mornings. People from nearby towns used to joke about it being cursed. In fact, many of them never visited, preferring to steer clear of the rumors that had floated around for generations. Hollow Bay, they said, had a reputation for strange things that happened when the fog rolled in thick, and for the ships that would appear and disappear without a trace. I never took those rumors seriously. I always figured they were just old legends passed down through generations, the kind of stories people tell to make life by the sea more interesting. But then I saw it for myself, and I haven't been able to look at the sea the same way since. It was just another Tuesday, like any other. The skies were overcast, the air was damp, and the town was as quiet as it usually was at the beginning of fall. I was working at the local shipyard, helping my dad fix up some boats, when he asked me if I wanted to take the small fishing boat out to catch some late afternoon cod. He had promised some of the regulars at the tavern they'd get fresh fish for dinner, and he needed me to help. "Sure, Dad. I'll grab my gear," I said, tying my boots tight. We didn't expect the fog. Hollow Bay had always been known for it, but this was different. This fog crept in so fast that we couldn't even see the shoreline from the dock after only a few minutes. It didn't look natural. It felt like something was pushing it toward us, almost like it was alive. "Looks like a storm's brewing," Dad muttered, casting a wary glance toward the thickening mist. Maybe we should wait, but I was eager to get out on the water. I wasn't the superstitious type. "It's just fog, Dad. No big deal." So we pushed off, and within moments, the dock, the town, and even the distant lighthouse disappeared into the dense, rolling fog. It felt like we were drifting in a dream, the world shrinking down to just the sound of the engine and the lapping of the waves against the boat. I didn't think much of it at first, but after we'd been out for about an hour, the fog started to get even thicker. The air grew colder, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The usual quiet sea was becoming disturbingly still. No seagulls, no distant sounds of waves crashing against the rocks. Just absolute silence. "Something's off," I said, looking around, my voice almost swallowed by the fog. Dad didn't respond. He had that worried look on his face, the one I hadn't seen in years, the one he always wore when something wasn't right. "Let's head back," I suggested, my voice growing uneasy. But as we turned the boat around, something caught my eye in the distance, something that shouldn't have been there. A ship, but not just any ship. The Glory of the Sea was its name, at least, that's what I later learned it had been called. It was a massive wooden ship, unlike any I had ever seen. Its sails were tattered and torn, and its hull was covered in moss and seaweed, as if it had been submerged underwater for years. The wood of the ship looked aged, as though it was rotting away, yet the ship was still sailing smoothly across the water, cutting through the mist without making a sound. I turned to my dad, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. "Dad, what is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He was frozen. I looked back toward the ship, now much closer. It didn't have any lights, no sign of life on board. The decks were eerily empty, and the wind didn't move its sails. Yet, the ship seemed to glide effortlessly toward us, as if drawn by some invisible force. I felt a strange pull in my chest, like something was calling to me from that ship. It was almost as if the ship was waiting for me to come closer. "Let's go," I said urgently. "Let's get out of here." But as I turned the boat away from the glory of the sea, the fog thickened, blocking our way. It was as if the mist itself was trapping us, forcing us to stay in place. My dad started the engine again, but it sputtered and died. "I can't get it started," he muttered under his breath, frantically trying to turn the key. The ship was now so close that I could see figures on the deck. But they weren't people. They were ghostly forms, barely visible through the mist. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were stuck in time, their faces obscured by shadows. And then the bell rang. It was a deep, mournful toll, one that reverberated through my bones. I looked at my dad, but his eyes were wide with terror. "We need to leave," he whispered. But before we could even react, the glory of the sea was right beside us, its shadow looming over our tiny boat. The figures on the deck seemed to notice us now, their eyes glowing faintly in the mist, their hands raised toward us. That's when I heard the voice. It wasn't coming from the ship, but from the water beneath us. "Help us." The voice was soft, almost pleading. It was the voice of a woman, strained and desperate. I turned toward my dad, but he was still staring at the ship, his face a mask of horror. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, his lips trembling. The fog seemed to swirl around us now, thicker than ever, and the water began to feel unnaturally cold. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel something pressing against me, as if the ship were reaching out, trying to draw me into its cursed grasp. "Come closer." I heard the voice again, this time louder, closer. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to look at the ship. The figures on board seemed to move, shifting in a way that made my blood run cold. They were no longer still, but moving toward the edge of the ship, their hands outstretched toward us. "Help us." That was when the fog cleared. In an instant, the glory of the sea was gone, vanishing as if it had never existed. The figures on board, the bell, the eerie presence, it was all gone. The fog lifted almost entirely, and the sea was calm again. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He was staring at the spot where the ship had been, his eyes wide with terror, his hands gripping the sides of the boat. "We need to get back," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Without waiting for me to respond, he started the engine again, and this time, it roared to life. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the dock, the fog gradually retreating as we neared the shore. The glory of the sea was gone, but the sense of dread remained, lingering in the air like a thick fog. When we got back to the dock, my dad didn't say a word. He just tied the boat up quickly, then led me away from the water. We didn't go to the tavern that night. We didn't talk about what had happened, but I could feel it in my chest, the truth of what we had seen. That ship, the glory of the sea, was no ordinary vessel. It was a ghost ship, cursed to sail the seas for eternity, its crew trapped in the fog, forever lost. I never told anyone what happened that night, not until now. Over the years, I've heard rumors from the other fishermen of strange sightings near Hollow Bay. They talk about the ghost ship, the glory of the sea, still sailing out there in the mist, waiting for the next soul to cross its path. They say that if you hear the bell tolling in the distance, you should stay away, because the ship doesn't just appear, it calls to you. And I've learned something else since that night. When the fog rolls in and the sea goes quiet, there's a chance you might hear that voice again. The voice of someone lost, trapped beneath the waves, waiting for help. But no one ever answers, and no one ever returns. I grew up in a small coastal village called Blackwater Bay, nestled between jagged cliffs and a sea that was as unpredictable as it was vast. The bay was known for its deep, dark waters, and the locals often whispered stories about a ghost ship that would appear out of the fog on moonless nights. I never put much stock into those tales, dismissing them as nothing more than the usual legends that haunt small towns near the sea. That is, until the night I saw the ship myself. It was late summer when I first heard the story of the Blackwater ghost ship. I had just turned 18, and like most of my friends, I was more interested in chasing thrills and taking risks than listening to the old folk tell their spooky stories. My dad ran a small fishing business, and I spent most of my days helping him, hauling in nets, cleaning fish, and maintaining the boats. The sea was my world. The idea that something supernatural could be hiding in the same waters that had always been my home seemed absurd. But then, during the late hours of one fateful night, everything changed. It started as an ordinary evening. The sun had just set, and I was finishing up a long day of work at the docks. The air was thick with salt, and the sky was a deep indigo, with only a few stars shining through the clouds. I had just finished tying up the last of the boats when I heard the distant sound of a bell. It was faint, almost like the ringing of a church bell, but it echoed across the water, sending a chill down my spine. I paused, looking out at the horizon. The fog was rolling in, as it often did during the evening hours, but tonight, it seemed thicker than usual, swirling across the water like a living thing. I shrugged it off and started walking back to the old boathouse where I lived with my father. But as I made my way up the path, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A ship. It wasn't a fishing boat or a pleasure yacht. It was an old, weathered ship with tall, torn sails and a dark hull that seemed to absorb the moonlight. The ship was sailing through the mist, moving slowly but with purpose, as if it was heading toward the shore. At first, I thought it was just one of the many ships that sometimes came into the bay, but something about it felt wrong. It didn't make any noise. The creaking of the wood, the splash of the waves against the hull, the usual sounds of a ship sailing through water. Nothing. It was as though it was gliding, completely silent, as if it weren't even really there. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look, but the ship didn't seem to notice me. It kept moving, its tall mast swaying in the fog, and the bell rang again. This time, it was louder, closer, almost as though it was calling to me. I was about to turn and run back to my father's house, but then something stopped me. A figure on deck. It was hard to make out through the fog, but there, standing at the helm of the ship, was a tall figure dressed in what looked like old-fashioned seafaring clothes. An old captain's hat, a long coat, and boots that seemed worn with age. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but I could sense that it was watching me. There was an eerie stillness to the figure, as if time itself had frozen around it. I stood rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as far away from that ship as possible. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something captivating about the figure, something that made me feel like I was being drawn into its gaze. Suddenly, the fog seemed to shift, and the ship began to disappear, just as silently as it had appeared. It faded into the mist, its bell tolling one last time before it was gone, swallowed by the night. I stood there, staring at the empty water, my breath coming in short gasps. Had I imagined it? Was it just the fog playing tricks on me? But I knew deep down that I hadn't. I had seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to exist. I didn't go back to the docks that night. I didn't even mention it to my father. I couldn't. I was too afraid. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I had been tired, or that the fog had distorted my vision. But I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing on the deck, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. The next day, I went to the local tavern to meet up with a few friends, trying to forget what had happened. We were talking about the usual things: boats, fishing, the weather, when I heard someone mention the Blackwater ghost ship. I froze. I had never heard anyone talk about it in such detail before. The old man sitting at the bar was telling a story that was eerily familiar to what I had seen the night before. They say the Blackwater ghost ship only appears when the fog is thick enough to hide it, the old man said, his voice gravelly. It's been seen by a few folks around here, but no one talks about it much. Most people just steer clear of the bay when the fog rolls in, just in case. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I listened. The ship's called the Elysium. The old man continued. It was lost many years ago, during a terrible storm. The captain and his crew were never found. Some say the ship still sails these waters, looking for something, or someone, to take its place. I couldn't believe it. The ship from the night before, the Elysium, was the same ship, the same bell, the same eerie silence. It was all true. Some say you can still hear the bell tolling from the ship, the old man added. They say it's a warning. If you hear it and see the ship, you're marked. The Elysium is cursed, and once you see it, you can never escape it. It comes for you. My blood ran cold. Was that what I had heard last night? Was that why the bell had rung so loudly in my ears? I didn't stay at the tavern much longer. I couldn't. I had to leave. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, the fog rolled in again, thicker than ever. The air was cold, and I could hear the soft sound of waves lapping against the shore. I told myself I wouldn't go out again. I wouldn't be tempted to see the ship, but as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the bell. It was faint at first, just a distant tolling, but it grew louder. The sound seemed to echo across the bay, reverberating in my bones. I tried to ignore it, to close my eyes and pretend I was imagining it, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was calling to me, urging me to go down to the water. I fought it. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, but the bell kept ringing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and walked to the door, my feet cold against the floorboards. When I opened the door, I was met by the thick fog, the same fog I had seen the night before. But this time, the fog was different. It was alive, swirling around me as if it had a mind of its own. And there, just beyond the edge of the fog, I saw it, the Elysium. It was sailing toward the shore, its tattered sails glowing faintly in the moonlight. The bell tolled again, louder this time, as if it were calling me directly. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I were frozen in place, caught in the grip of the ship's curse. The figures on the deck were there again, staring at me with hollow eyes. I could feel their gaze on me, drawing me closer. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the Elysium vanished, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart racing. It was gone, but I knew deep down that it hadn't left. The ship was still out there, waiting. The next morning, the fog was gone, and the bay was calm again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had been following me since that night. And every time the fog rolls in now, I hear the bell tolling in the distance. I know the Elysium is out there, still waiting for the next soul to mark. And I wonder, who will it be next? It's funny how quickly you can grow accustomed to something as strange as ghost stories when you've heard them all your life. As a child, I lived in a small town called Mist Harbor, a place nestled along the coast, where the fog seemed to come and go with a life of its own. Growing up, we'd often hear about the ghost ships that sailed out from the fog at night. But like any kid, I thought those were just stories, just the stuff of legend, or so I thought, until one night I saw it for myself. The town of Mist Harbor wasn't much to look at, just a cluster of weather-beaten houses, a few shops, and a harbor with a handful of old fishing boats. My parents ran a small inn that overlooked the docks. The salty smell of the sea was always in the air, mixed with the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. People came from other towns to spend a quiet weekend by the sea, and when they left, they often spoke of the mysterious fog that rolled in each night, swallowing the town in a thick, cold mist. And it was the fog that brought with it the stories of the ghost ship. There were rumors that the ship, known as the Phantom Mariner, appeared on the rarest of nights, when the fog was thick enough to hide it from view. They said it was a grand ship from a time long past, its sails tattered and its wood rotting, as if it had been floating in the ocean for centuries. The story went that the ship and its crew were lost during a violent storm many years ago, and their souls were doomed to sail the seas forever, never to find rest. They said the ship would appear from the fog, drifting silently along the coastline, only to vanish just as quickly as it came, never to be seen again. But, like most of the other kids in town, I didn't believe in ghost ships. I'd heard the stories countless times, and while they were spooky, they were just that, stories. Nothing more. It wasn't until the summer of my 17th year that I realized how wrong I was. It started with a quiet night, the kind where the sea was calm and the air was so still that you could hear the occasional creak of the old pier from our inn. I had just finished helping my parents close up the inn for the night when I decided to take a walk down to the harbor. It was something I did often, just to clear my head. The mist had rolled in thick that evening, more so than usual, and as I walked toward the docks, the world seemed to disappear around me. The soft crunch of my boots on the gravel path was the only sound I could hear. The fog was so dense I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, but I kept walking, drawn toward the water. The moon was barely visible through the mist, casting an eerie glow over everything, as though the whole world was wrapped in a strange, haunting dream. I reached the end of the pier, and it was there, standing at the edge of the dock, that I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a bell. Low, slow, like the tolling of a distant church bell. It echoed through the fog, and for a moment, I froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and my heart started to race. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was probably just the wind, or maybe someone on one of the boats. But the sound continued, growing louder and clearer with each passing second, until it was as if the bell was right beside me. That's when I heard the next sound, something much more alarming. A voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper. "Help me." I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I looked around, my heart now pounding in my chest. The fog seemed to swirl around me, closing in tighter, and the air grew cold, much colder than it should have been. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back, looking down at the water, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it. A shape emerged from the fog, a massive ship, its tall sails tattered and torn, its hull dark and weathered. It moved silently through the fog, like a shadow gliding across the water. There were no lights on the ship, no crew to be seen, just the silhouette of the ship moving steadily through the mist. The bell rang again, louder this time. As the ship drew closer, I felt a strange compulsion to step forward, to move closer to the water. I couldn't explain why, but something deep inside me urged me to approach the ship, to see it up close. But before I could take a step, something stopped me. The ship was vanishing. It wasn't disappearing in the usual way, like it was sailing away into the distance. It was fading, sinking back into the fog, as though it was never there at all. In the span of a few seconds, the Phantom Mariner had completely vanished, leaving only the thick fog and the ringing of the bell. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what I had just seen. I was shaken, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I had to know what had just happened. I walked to the edge of the pier, peering out into the mist. The fog had swallowed the ship whole, and now the water was eerily still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but the ship didn't return. Finally, I turned and walked back to the inn, my thoughts swirling with what I had just witnessed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the tolling of the bell, echoing in my mind. I kept seeing the image of the ghost ship, its tattered sails drifting silently through the fog, as if it had never left. I wondered if I had imagined it, if the fog had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it had been real. It had to have been. The next day, I decided to talk to some of the older folks in town. They'd always been the ones to tell the stories of the ghost ships, so maybe they could shed some light on what I had seen. I went to the local tavern, where the older fishermen often gathered to tell their tales. One man, old Captain Hayes, had been around for decades. His weathered face was full of wrinkles, his hands rough from years of working the sea. When I approached him and asked about the Phantom Mariner, his eyes darkened. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice grave. "The ship in the fog." I nodded, my throat tightening. "What is it? What's happening?" He took a long drink from his mug before speaking. "That ship is cursed. It's the Phantom Mariner. A ship that disappeared long ago, lost during a storm. The crew was never found, and some say the ship still sails these waters, waiting for souls to replace those who perished with it. He paused, looking me square in the eye. They say if you hear the bell, it's a warning, a sign that the ship is near, and if you're not careful, you might find yourself aboard it. I shivered at his words. The bell. It had sounded like a warning, hadn't it? Like something was trying to reach out to me. Captain Hayes continued. No one really knows why it appears, or how it chooses who it calls to, but there are stories. Some people say the ship comes to claim those who have unfinished business, while others believe it's simply looking for more souls to take. The one thing everyone agrees on is this. Once you see the Phantom Mariner, you're marked. It's only a matter of time before it comes for you again. I left the tavern in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that the ship was still out there, waiting for me. Over the next few weeks, I kept an eye on the water, hoping I wouldn't see it again. But the fog returned night after night, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, I could almost hear the faint ringing of the bell, echoing in the distance. I tried to go on with my life, but the Phantom Mariner never left my mind. And then, one night, as the fog rolled in thicker than I had ever seen it, I heard the bell again, soft at first, then louder, drawing me toward the water. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the docks, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the edge of the pier, I saw it. The Phantom Mariner, drifting silently through the mist, its sails ghostly in the moonlight. It had returned. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, unable to look away. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The ship was real, and so was the curse. I had always loved the ocean. As a child, I would spend hours at the beach near my family's small house, watching the waves crash against the rocks and listening to the calls of distant gulls. My family wasn't rich by any means, but we were comfortable enough in the small coastal town of Harbor's Edge. Nestled at the foot of Lantern Isle, we lived a quiet life far from the hustle and bustle of city life. But there was always something strange about the island. The locals often spoke of a mysterious ship that would appear on the horizon, only to vanish before it could reach the shore. I had heard the stories my whole life, but I never believed them. That was until the night I saw it for myself. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first saw the ghost ship. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with hues of orange and pink. I was walking along the beach, as I often did after dinner, with the cool ocean breeze ruffling my hair. The waves were gentle, their rhythmic sound soothing my mind. But tonight was different. The air was thick with tension, and there was an eerie stillness that made my skin prickle. It was as if the world was holding its breath. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn toward Lantern Isle. It wasn't a long swim across the small stretch of water, but the island was known for its rocky shore and dangerous tides. Still, something pulled at me, urging me to make the journey. I had heard the rumors, of course. The stories of a ship that appeared only on moonless nights, a ship whose bell would toll in the distance and whose crew was said to be lost at sea, forever doomed to sail the waters around Lantern Isle. The ghost of the lantern was what they called it, a vessel that appeared and disappeared without a trace. I had always dismissed it as a tale spun by old sailors with too much time on their hands. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stories were true. I grabbed a small flashlight and set off down the shore toward the cove where the water was shallow enough to cross. The moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds, casting the island in complete darkness. As I waded into the cool water, I shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. My heart beat faster, a sense of unease settling deep in my chest. The cove was eerily quiet as I made my way across, my feet sinking into the soft sand beneath the water. The sound of my breathing seemed too loud in the stillness. When I finally reached the shore of Lantern Isle, I took a moment to catch my breath. The island seemed to loom ahead, its dense forest and jagged cliffs swallowed by the night. The air was thick with fog, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I had heard about the strange happenings on Lantern Isle, how some who had ventured too far into the woods had never returned. Others claimed to have heard strange voices calling their names from the trees. But none of that mattered now. I was here, and I had to see this ship for myself. As I ventured deeper into the island, the fog grew thicker. It wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, muffling my footsteps and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The silence was almost oppressive, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the quiet. I was beginning to second-guess my decision when I heard it. A bell, faint at first, like the distant toll of a church bell. The sound seemed to drift on the wind, far off but unmistakable. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I knew what this meant. It was the bell of the ghost of the lantern. The sound grew louder, closer now, until it seemed to echo through the fog. My heart raced, and I hurried toward the sound, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. I had to see it. I had to know if the stories were true. As I reached the edge of the cliff overlooking the water, I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was. The ship appeared through the fog, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was a tall, dark vessel, with tattered sails and a hull that looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The ship moved silently through the water, as if gliding on an unseen current. The bell tolled again, the sound sending a shiver through my spine. I stepped back, my mind racing. This was no ordinary ship. It was the ghost of the lantern, just as the stories had said. But how could it be real? How could a ship that had been lost at sea so many years ago still be here, sailing in the fog, so close I could hear its bell tolling? I took another step closer to the edge of the cliff, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to reach out, to touch the ship, but I knew that would be impossible. It was as if the ship existed in a different realm, one that was not bound by the rules of time and space. The fog thickened around it, swallowing it whole, and before I could blink, it vanished. I stood there, stunned, as the ship disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint echo of its bell behind. The fog closed in around me, and I was left alone on the cliff, my mind spinning. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled deep in my chest, but it wouldn't go away. The ghost of the lantern was no mere legend. It was real. I had seen it with my own eyes. I turned and hurried back down to the shore, my legs trembling beneath me. The fog seemed to part as I reached the water, and I waded back into the cold ocean, desperate to leave the island behind. But as I swam back toward the mainland, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the fog. The next morning, I told no one about what had happened. How could I? Who would believe me? The people in Harbor's Edge had always spoken in hushed tones about the ghost ship, but I knew that if I shared my story, I would be labeled a fool or worse. They would think I had imagined it, that the fog had played tricks on my mind. But I knew the truth. The ship had been real. The ghost of the lantern had appeared to me, just as the old sailors had warned. Over the next few days, I tried to go on with my life, but I couldn't forget the sight of the ship, the tolling of its bell, the eerie silence that surrounded it. I found myself watching the horizon every evening, hoping to see it again. And one night I did. The fog was back, thicker than ever, and the bell tolled in the distance, just as it had the first time. I could hear it clearly, louder now, as if calling me. I fought the urge to go to Lantern Isle again, but the pull was too strong. This time, when I reached the island, the fog was even thicker. It swallowed the trees, the rocks, and the ground beneath my feet. I could barely see anything, but I knew the ship was out there, waiting for me. The bell tolled again, closer this time. Echoing in the air, its sound vibrating in my bones. I made my way toward the shore, but this time, I wasn't alone. A figure stood there, waiting. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by the hood of his coat. He stood motionless, staring out at the water. "Who are you?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he raised his arm and pointed toward the horizon. I followed his gesture, and there it was. The ghost of the lantern was approaching, its sails billowing in the wind, its hull gleaming faintly in the fog. The bell tolled again, louder this time, the sound sending a chill through my spine. The figure spoke then, his voice low and hollow. "You've seen it now, haven't you? The ship that never leaves. The crew that never finds peace." I nodded, unable to speak. The ship was getting closer. "You're marked now," the figure continued, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "It comes for those who see it. It always comes for them." With those final words, the figure turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone as the ship drew near. The ghost of the lantern was upon me now, its sails rising like ghosts in the mist. It was real. It was here, and I knew, deep down, that it would never let me go. The ship vanished again, just as it had before, leaving only the toll of its bell lingering in the silence. But now, I knew the truth. The ghost of the lantern would always return, and it would always be waiting for me.